The lantern flickered in Dr. Jonathan Hayes' hands as he approached the makeshift holding cell behind Fort Grant's infirmary, where the wounded Apache woman had been chained for 3 days without proper medical care. The soldiers had warned him she was dangerous, feral even, having bitten 2 orderlies who tried to examine her injuries. Through the iron bars, he could see her huddled in the corner, long black hair matted with dried blood, her arm wrapped in filthy bandages that hadn't been changed since her capture. What he didn't know was that treating her wounds would unravel a conspiracy that reached from the reservation agency all the way to Washington, and that her scars held secrets that would cost him everything he'd built in 8 years on the frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The New Mexico Territory, summer of 1882, brought heat that could kill a man before noon if he wasn't careful. Dr. Jonathan Hayes had learned that lesson his first week at Fort Grant, when a private from Massachusetts collapsed during formation and never regained consciousness. Now, after 8 years practicing medicine on the frontier, Jonathan moved through the suffocating July morning with the efficiency of someone who understood the land's brutality. His medical office occupied a converted storage building adjacent to the fort's main infirmary. The space was cramped but organized with surgical precision, shelves lined with carefully labeled bottles of laudanum, quinine and carbolic acid, surgical instruments boiled and wrapped in clean cloth, and an examination table positioned beneath the room's single window to capture maximum light. Jonathan had fought the army bureaucracy for 2 years to get proper ventilation installed, arguing that miasmic vapors contributed to post-surgical infections. The brass had finally relented after a colonel's son nearly died from sepsis following a routine appendectomy. At 34, Jonathan cut an unimposing figure, medium height, slender build, with wire-rimmed spectacles that constantly slid down his nose during surgery. His brown hair had begun to thin prematurely, and his hands bore the permanent ink stains of someone who documented everything meticulously. Other officers found him peculiar, too educated for casual conversation, too principled for the compromises frontier military life demanded, and far too interested in treating indigenous patients with the same care he afforded white soldiers. He had come west from Philadelphia after completing his medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania, where his professors had praised his surgical skill but worried about his excessive empathy for patients. The frontier had seemed to offer both adventure and purpose, a chance to practice medicine where it was desperately needed, far from the rigid hierarchies of East Coast hospitals, where one's family connections mattered more than one's abilities. The decision had cost him his engagement. Catherine Westmore, daughter of a prominent Philadelphia banker, had been willing to marry a doctor, but not one foolish enough to abandon civilization for what she called playing surgeon to savages and soldiers in some god-forsaken desert. Jonathan had chosen medicine over marriage, a decision he revisited during lonely nights in his quarters, wondering if principle was adequate compensation for companionship. His practice at Fort Grant had been rewarding in its own way. He'd successfully treated cholera outbreaks, performed amputations that saved lives others had written off, and even delivered babies for officers' wives when the post-surgeon was too drunk to function. That surgeon, Major William Thornton, had been a competent physician once, but 20 years on the frontier and a whiskey habit had reduced him to performing only the most routine procedures. Jonathan handled everything else, operating in a grey area where his civilian status gave him just enough authority to practice medicine, but not enough to challenge military decisions. The arrangement worked until it didn't, which was precisely what happened when Captain Richard Dalton arrived at Fort Grant 6 months earlier to assume command of Indian affairs for the regional territory. Dalton was everything Jonathan was not: tall, commanding, with a military bearing that demanded deference. He'd fought with distinction during the Indian Wars of the 1870s and had earned a reputation as a man who understood how to handle the Apache problem. His solution, as Jonathan quickly learned, involved systematic reduction of food rations on reservations, forcing indigenous families into starvation that would either kill them outright or compel them to sign away their remaining land rights in exchange for survival. The doctor had witnessed the results of Dalton's policies firsthand. Malnourished children brought to the fort by desperate parents, elderly Apache dying from preventable diseases because medical supplies designated for reservation use mysteriously disappeared, and an increasing number of violent incidents as starving families raided supply wagons or abandoned the reservation entirely. Jonathan had attempted to address these concerns through official channels, submitting detailed reports to the fort commander about malnutrition rates and disease patterns that clearly indicated systemic neglect. His reports were acknowledged, filed, and ignored. When he pressed the issue during a staff meeting, Captain Dalton had responded with thinly veiled hostility. "Dr. Hayes, your medical expertise is valued, but you lack understanding of the broader strategic situation. The Apache must be taught to abandon their primitive ways and embrace civilization. Discomfort is part of that education." Jonathan had wanted to respond that starvation wasn't education, it was genocide. He'd remained silent instead, recognizing that challenging Dalton publicly would only reduce his ability to help anyone. Better to work within the system, treating patients as they came, and documenting everything in case someone with actual authority ever decided to investigate. That fragile compromise shattered 3 days ago when soldiers brought in a wounded Apache woman who had been captured during a skirmish near the reservation boundary. According to the patrol report, she'd been part of a group attempting to hunt antelope on land, technically outside reservation limits. When confronted by soldiers enforcing Dalton's policy that Apache must remain within designated boundaries, the hunting party had scattered. This woman had been shot during the pursuit, sustaining injuries to her shoulder and leg before being subdued. The patrol had brought her to Fort Grant in chains, depositing her in a holding cell rather than the infirmary. When Jonathan inquired about her medical condition, he was informed by the duty sergeant that Captain Dalton had ordered her confined until she could be questioned about other Apache who had left the reservation without permission. "She needs medical attention," Jonathan had insisted. "Gunshot wounds left untreated for days can turn septic." "Captain's orders, sir. She's to remain in custody until he completes his investigation. Says there's been too much coddling of hostiles who break the rules." Jonathan had attempted to examine her that first day, approaching the cell with his medical bag and what he hoped was a non-threatening demeanor. The woman had been conscious, but clearly in pain, backed into the far corner of the small space. When he'd reached through the bars to assess her injuries, she'd lunged forward with startling speed and bitten his forearm hard enough to draw blood. He'd jerked back instinctively, more surprised than injured. The soldiers guarding the cell had laughed at his expense, one commenting that the doc just learned why we keep savages locked up proper. A second attempt the following day had ended similarly. This time she'd bitten an orderly who accompanied Jonathan, causing enough damage that the young man required stitches. After that incident, Major Thornton had issued an order that no one was to approach the prisoner without armed guards present, and that her medical needs were secondary to security concerns. Jonathan had spent the past 72 hours increasingly troubled by the situation. The woman's wounds weren't being treated. She was being given minimal water and no food. Her condition was deteriorating in ways that any competent physician could see, even from a distance. And Captain Dalton seemed in no hurry to conclude his investigation, suggesting that her suffering was less oversight than deliberate policy. On the evening of the third day, Jonathan made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life irrevocably. He would treat the prisoner's injuries, whether officially authorized or not, because his oath as a physician superseded military regulations about the proper handling of captured Apache. He waited until after midnight, when the fort had settled into the relative quiet of evening watch rotations. Most soldiers were either asleep or focused on perimeter security, not on guarding a single wounded woman who posed no realistic threat to escape. The guard posted outside the holding area was a young private named Dennis Murphy, barely 19, who'd been assigned to Fort Grant only 2 months earlier. Jonathan approached carrying his medical bag and a lantern, projecting the confident authority of someone engaged in officially sanctioned business. "Evening, Private Murphy. I'm here to examine the prisoner." The young soldier straightened uncertainly. "Sir, I was told no one's supposed to go near her without Captain Dalton's approval." "Captain Dalton's approval for medical treatment would be a court-martial offense, Private. Military regulations are explicit that prisoners must receive adequate medical care regardless of their status. I'm not asking permission to treat her. I'm informing you that I'm fulfilling my legal obligation as the fort's physician." The authoritative tone and invocation of regulations did its work. Murphy stepped aside, though his expression suggested he expected consequences for them both. The holding area consisted of 3 cells in a converted storage room behind the infirmary. The wounded woman occupied the farthest cell, positioned where she could be observed, but was largely isolated from other parts of the fort. As Jonathan approached, lantern raised, he could see her more clearly than during his previous attempts. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, though frontier hardship often aged people beyond their years. Her shoulder-length black hair was tangled and matted with blood from a head wound Jonathan hadn't previously noticed. Her right shoulder showed signs of a gunshot injury. The crude bandage applied by soldiers was soaked through with fluid that suggested infection. Her left leg was also bandaged, though less severely damaged from what he could observe, but it was her face that struck him most powerfully. Even in pain, even dirty and wounded and chained like an animal, there was a fierce dignity in her expression. Her dark eyes tracked his movements with sharp intelligence, assessing him as a potential threat despite his medical bag and non-threatening posture. "I'm Dr. Jonathan Hayes," he said quietly, setting down his lantern. "I'm going to treat your injuries. I won't hurt you, but I need to examine your wounds." She said nothing, her expression unchanged. He wasn't certain how much English she understood, if any. Jonathan unlocked the cell door slowly, moving with deliberate care to avoid sudden movements that might trigger another defensive attack. As he entered, the woman shifted slightly, her weight moving to her good leg, body tensing for fight or flight, despite the chains that limited her movement. "I know you're in pain," he continued, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Your shoulder is infected. Without treatment, the infection will spread through your bloodstream and kill you. I need to clean the wound, remove any bullet fragments, and apply proper bandages." He knelt several feet away from her, opening his medical bag to display its contents. Bandages, bottles of antiseptic, surgical instruments. Not weapons, but tools of healing. For a long moment they remained in this tableau. The doctor kneeling with his instruments displayed, the wounded woman pressed against the wall, both assessing the risks of trust. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in her expression. Not trust, exactly, but perhaps a calculation that her chances of survival improved with medical treatment. Even from someone representing the people who had shot her, she didn't move toward him, but she stopped pressing quite so desperately against the wall. It was the smallest of concessions, but Jonathan recognized it as permission to proceed. He began with her shoulder, the most serious injury. As he carefully unwrapped the filthy bandage, the extent of the damage became apparent. The bullet had entered high on her right shoulder, creating a wound that had been bleeding intermittently for days. Worse, the entry wound showed clear signs of infection, inflamed tissue, purulent discharge, and heat that indicated fever. "This is going to hurt," he warned, preparing a carbolic acid solution to clean the wound. "I'm sorry." When he applied the antiseptic, her entire body went rigid, but she made no sound. No cry of pain, no whimper, nothing. Only her clenched jaw, and the sweat that broke out across her forehead betrayed the agony she must be experiencing. Jonathan worked with focused efficiency, cleaning the wound thoroughly before probing carefully for bullet fragments. He located 2 small pieces of lead still embedded in the tissue and removed them with forceps, a procedure that would have had most patients screaming or unconscious. She endured it in absolute silence, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cell walls. As he worked, Jonathan found himself studying her face in the lantern light. She had high cheekbones and a strong jawline, features that spoke of both beauty and resilience. But it was the scars that drew his attention, not the fresh wounds from bullets, but older marks that told stories of previous violence. A thin white line across her left cheekbone, what appeared to be burn scars on her neck, and when he shifted to examine her leg wound, he noticed scarring on her arms that looked deliberate, ritualistic perhaps, or evidence of past injuries. The leg wound proved less severe than the shoulder, a deep graze rather than a penetrating injury. It would heal with proper care and rest. But as Jonathan applied clean bandages to both injuries, he found himself troubled by questions beyond the immediate medical situation. Who was this woman? Why had she been hunting outside reservation boundaries, risking exactly this kind of violent confrontation? And what had created the scars that marked her body like a map of past suffering? When he finished bandaging her wounds, Jonathan sat back on his heels, studying his patient with professional concern. She was malnourished, probably for months. Her fever was concerning, but not yet at critical levels. With proper care, adequate nutrition and rest, she should recover physically. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're going to survive," he told her, unsure if she understood, but needing to say it anyway. "I'll come back tomorrow to change your bandages and check for signs the infection is responding to treatment." As he gathered his instruments and prepared to leave, she spoke for the first time. A single word in Apache, followed by 3 words in heavily accented English. "Why, help me." Jonathan paused, considering his response carefully. It was the same question he'd asked himself over the past 3 days, as he'd watched her condition deteriorate in this cell. "Because you're a human being who's suffering," he answered simply. That's reason enough. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise perhaps, or skepticism that anyone associated with the soldiers who'd shot her could operate from such straightforward moral principles. He left the cell, locking it behind him as regulations required, though the gesture felt obscene after what he'd just done. Treating her wounds while she remained chained like an animal wasn't healing. It was just prolonging her captivity with slightly better medical care. As Jonathan walked back to his quarters through the fort's dark pathways, he understood that he'd crossed a line tonight that couldn't be uncrossed. He'd defied Captain Dalton's implicit order to let the prisoner's medical needs remain unaddressed. When the captain discovered that treatment had been provided, there would be consequences. What Jonathan didn't yet know was that the wounded woman he'd just treated was Ayasha Naiche, daughter of a respected Apache leader who died resisting forced relocation 3 years earlier. That she'd witnessed things that would expose corruption reaching far beyond Fort Grant. That her scars carried stories that would transform his understanding of everything happening in the territory, and he certainly didn't know that healing her wounds was the simplest part of what lay ahead, because the conspiracy that had put her in that cell was far larger and more dangerous than a frontier doctor could possibly imagine. Morning arrived with the harsh clarity that only desert sunlight could provide. Jonathan had barely slept, his mind cycling through scenarios of how Captain Dalton would react once he discovered the unauthorized medical treatment. He dressed quickly and made his way to the officers' mess, where he encountered exactly what he'd been dreading. Captain Dalton sat at the head table, his breakfast untouched, holding a report that Private Murphy had apparently filed about the previous night's activities. The captain's face was rigid with controlled anger as Jonathan entered. "Dr. Hayes, a word in my office. Now." The walk across the parade ground felt interminable. Other officers paused in their morning routines to watch, sensing the coming confrontation. Dalton's office occupied the prime corner of the administrative building, decorated with military commendations and tribal artifacts he'd collected as trophies from various campaigns. The captain didn't invite Jonathan to sit. "You treated the Apache prisoner last night without authorization. I treated a patient with life-threatening injuries, as my medical oath requires." Dalton's jaw tightened. "That woman is not a patient, Doctor. She's a hostile combatant, being held for questioning about illegal activities off the reservation. Her comfort is not your concern. Her survival is absolutely my concern. Gunshot wounds left untreated for 3 days had created infections that would have killed her within a week." "That's not an interrogation strategy, Captain. That's negligent homicide." The accusation hung between them like drawn steel. Dalton rose slowly from his chair, moving around the desk until he stood directly in front of Jonathan, using his superior height as intimidation. "You forget yourself, Doctor. This is a military installation operating under wartime protocols. The Apache are enemy combatants who have terrorized settlers, murdered families, and consistently violated treaty obligations. That woman you're so concerned about was caught hunting on land she has no legal right to access. She was hunting because the rations provided to her people are insufficient to sustain life," Jonathan countered, holding his ground despite Dalton's physical proximity. "I've documented malnutrition rates on the reservation that constitute a deliberate starvation policy." "That's not military strategy, it's ethnic cleansing." Dalton's hand moved so quickly, Jonathan barely saw it coming. The slap across his face wasn't hard enough to cause real injury, but the humiliation was instant and complete. No officer had ever struck him before. The violation of that boundary revealed just how far outside normal military conduct Dalton was willing to operate. "You will not make such accusations again," Dalton said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're a civilian contractor, Dr. Hayes. Your position here exists at my discretion. Continue interfering with military operations, and you'll find yourself on the next supply wagon back to wherever insignificant town spawned you." Jonathan's face burned where he'd been struck, but he forced himself to meet Dalton's gaze directly. "My contract is with the Army Medical Department, not with your command specifically. And my authority to provide medical care supersedes your authority to deny it. If you want me removed, you'll need to file official charges." "I welcome that process, actually, since it would create a formal record of why you're opposed to treating wounded prisoners." It was a calculated gamble. Dalton wanted Jonathan gone, but official charges would require documentation that might expose the captain's policies to scrutiny from higher command. The threat of bureaucratic investigation was often more effective than direct confrontation in military hierarchies. Dalton's expression shifted subtly, recognizing the trap Jonathan had laid. "Get out of my office, Doctor. But understand this, the Apache woman will be transferred to the territorial prison in Santa Fe within the week. After that, her medical care becomes someone else's problem, and yours ends." Jonathan left without responding, his heart pounding with adrenaline and the knowledge that he'd just made a powerful enemy. But he'd also bought time. A week to treat Ayesha's injuries, and perhaps discover why Dalton was so determined to prevent her from receiving proper care. He returned to the holding area that afternoon, this time with official documentation from Major Thornton, authorizing continued medical treatment. The post-surgeon had signed the order while nursing his morning whiskey, barely reading what Jonathan had placed before him. It wouldn't provide much protection if Dalton chose to press the issue, but it created a paper trail that might prove useful later. Ayesha was conscious when he entered her cell, her eyes tracking him with the same wary intelligence he'd observed the previous night. Her fever had decreased slightly, a good sign that her body was beginning to fight the infection. Jonathan set down his medical bag and began the process of changing her bandages, working with gentle efficiency. "Your shoulder is responding to treatment," he told her, examining the wound carefully. "The infection is stabilizing. With continued care, you should recover full mobility." She remained silent as he worked. But he noticed her breathing change slightly when he touched the older scars on her arm. Subtle flinching that suggested those marks carried painful memories beyond physical sensation. "These scars," Jonathan said carefully, indicating the deliberate patterns on her forearm. "They're not from accidents." For a long moment he thought she wouldn't respond. Then she spoke, her English halting but clear. "Reservation school. Mission school, they call it. When we speak our language, they burn us. When we resist their God, they burn us. These marks," she indicated the scars, "they say we are saved now." The casual brutality of it struck Jonathan like a physical blow. He'd heard rumors about the reservation schools, where indigenous children were forcibly separated from their families and subjected to what authorities called civilizing education. But hearing it described firsthand, seeing the permanent evidence burned into her flesh, transformed abstract policy into intimate horror. "How old were you?" 10 summers when soldiers brought me. 14 when I escaped." Jonathan's hands stilled on the bandage he was wrapping. "You escaped? From the mission school?" Ayasha nodded slightly. "Many try. Most are caught, beaten, returned. I hid in the mountains for 2 months before my father found me. He was chief then, before soldiers killed him at the water rights meeting. The pieces were beginning to form a larger picture." "Water rights meeting?" 3 years passed. Reservation agent promised Apache could use the river for crops, for drinking water. My father went to sign the agreement. Soldiers opened fire. Said Apache attacked first, but that was a lie. I was there, hidden in the trees. Soldiers shot first. Killed my father. Killed 6 others who came for peace talks. Jonathan sat back on his heels, processing this information. He'd been at Fort Grant for 8 years, had heard the official account of that incident. A tragic misunderstanding, the report had claimed, where Apache warriors had misinterpreted defensive postures as hostile and initiated combat. The soldiers had responded in self-defense, but Ayasha described something entirely different. A planned ambush, disguised as a negotiation. Murder presented as justified military action. Who was the reservation agent? Jonathan asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Captain Dalton. He came 2 months before the water meeting. Told my father the old agreements were finished, that new rules would be followed. When my father insisted on honoring the previous treaty, Dalton said there would be consequences. The implications were staggering. If Ayasha's account was accurate, and Jonathan found himself believing her, then Captain Dalton had orchestrated the killing of Apache leaders who resisted his authority. The water rights meeting had been a trap, eliminating opposition under the cover of a supposed Apache attack. "Why are you telling me this?" Jonathan asked. Ayasha's dark eyes met his with an intensity that made him acutely aware of every assumption he'd carried about the people the military labeled as hostiles. "Because you asked why I hunt outside the reservation. Because you treat my wounds when others would let me die. Because maybe one white man should know the truth about what happens to my people." Before Jonathan could respond, boots sounded in the corridor outside. He quickly finished securing the bandage and gathered his instruments just as Private Murphy appeared at the cell entrance. "Dr. Hayes, sir. Major Thornton needs you at the infirmary." "There's been an accident at the stable." Jonathan nodded, closing his medical bag. As he turned to leave, Ayasha spoke one more time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful, Doctor. Dalton kills anyone who threatens his plans. White or Apache, makes no difference to him." The warning followed Jonathan as he hurried to the infirmary, where a stable hand had been kicked by a horse and suffered a compound fracture of the leg. The injury required his full attention for the next several hours. Setting the bone, suturing the torn flesh, administering laudanum for pain management. By the time he finished, evening had settled over the fort. He was cleaning his surgical instruments when Major Thornton entered, more sober than usual, his expression troubled. "Jonathan, we need to talk. Not here, too many ears. Meet me behind the quartermaster's warehouse in 10 minutes. The clandestine nature of the request immediately put Jonathan on alert. Thornton was typically too drunk or apathetic to involve himself in anything requiring discretion. His sudden sobriety and obvious concern suggested something significant had occurred. Jonathan found the Major waiting in the shadows behind the warehouse, nervously smoking a cigarette. Thornton looked around to ensure they were alone before speaking. "I received an interesting visitor this afternoon. Civilian contractor named Howard Pemberton claims to be conducting an audit of reservation supply distribution for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He's asking questions about food shipments, medical supplies, and financial records related to Captain Dalton's management of regional reservations." An official audit. Thornton shook his head. "That's just it. I don't think it's official at all. Pemberton was too nervous, too careful about who might overhear our conversation. I think he's investigating Dalton independently, possibly working for someone in Washington who has suspicions about how the captain runs his operations." Jonathan's mind raced through the implications. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing substantive. I'm too close to pension eligibility to risk my career on suspicions. But I mentioned that our civilian physician had raised concerns about malnutrition patterns and inadequate medical care on the reservations." Thornton fixed Jonathan with a serious look. "He wants to speak with you, privately, tomorrow afternoon at the trading post in town. Does Dalton know about this audit?" "Not yet, as far as I can determine. Pemberton arrived quietly, using the cover of routine supply inspection. But it won't stay secret for long. Dalton has informants throughout the territory." The Major dropped his cigarette and crushed it beneath his boot. "You need to decide how much you're willing to risk, Jonathan. If Pemberton is legitimate and you provide evidence of wrongdoing, you might actually stop what's happening on the reservations. But if Dalton discovers your cooperation, you won't just lose your position here. You might lose considerably more." The threat was clear. Dalton had already demonstrated his willingness to use violence to protect his interests. An audit that exposed his corruption would prompt even more extreme responses. "What would you do?" Jonathan asked. Thornton was silent for a long moment. 20 years ago, I would have done the right thing without hesitation. Now?" He shrugged wearily. "Now I count the months until I can retire with my pension and try not to think too much about the compromises I've made to reach that finish line. But you're not me, Jonathan. You haven't accumulated enough cynicism yet to ignore your conscience." After Thornton departed, Jonathan remained in the shadows behind the warehouse, weighing impossible choices. Meeting with Pemberton meant committing fully to exposing Dalton, accepting whatever consequences followed. Refusing meant allowing the systematic starvation and abuse of the Apache to continue unchallenged. He thought of Ayesha chained in that cell, bearing scars from a childhood stolen by institutions that claimed to civilize while actually destroying. He thought of the malnourished children he'd treated, the preventable deaths he'd documented, the slow genocide disguised as federal Indian policy. The decision, he realized, had already been made the moment he chose to treat Ayesha's wounds, despite Dalton's implicit prohibition. Everything since then was simply following the logical consequences of that initial commitment to his principles over his security. He would meet with Howard Pemberton tomorrow. He would provide whatever evidence he possessed about conditions on the reservations, and he would accept that doing so would fundamentally alter his life in ways he couldn't yet predict. As Jonathan walked back to his quarters under a sky brilliant with stars, he understood that he'd moved beyond the safe middle ground he'd occupied for 8 years. He could no longer practice medicine while remaining carefully neutral about the policies that created so much suffering. The wounded woman in that cell had forced him to confront a truth he'd been avoiding. That neutrality in the face of systematic injustice was itself a form of complicity. Whatever came next, at least he would face it knowing he'd chosen integrity over comfort. In the moral calculus of frontier medicine, that would have to be enough. The night settled over Fort Grant with its usual sounds, sentries calling positions, horses shifting in the stable, the distant howl of coyotes beyond the walls. But beneath that familiar rhythm, something had changed. Forces were now in motion that would expose secrets powerful men had worked to keep hidden, and Jonathan Hayes, the unassuming physician who'd simply wanted to treat his patients without interference, had just become the most dangerous person at Fort Grant. The trading post sat at the edge of the civilian settlement that had grown up around Fort Grant, a weathered adobe structure that served as general store, post office, and unofficial gathering place for anyone seeking information or gossip. Jonathan arrived just after 2 o'clock, ostensibly to purchase medical supplies that couldn't be requisitioned through military channels. Howard Pemberton was easier to identify than Jonathan had anticipated. The man stood near the back corner of the store, pretending to examine a display of leather goods while periodically glancing toward the entrance. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and the careful posture of someone accustomed to observing without being observed. His suit was Eastern in style but dusty from travel, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who made his living uncovering things others preferred to keep hidden. Jonathan approached casually, picking up a bottle of carbolic acid from a nearby shelf. "Mr. Pemberton, Major Thornton suggested you might want to discuss supply distribution procedures." Pemberton's expression remained neutral, but his eyes flickered with recognition. "Dr. Hayes, perhaps we could speak more privately? There's a back room the proprietor sometimes makes available for confidential business discussions." The room in question was little more than a storage closet with a single chair and crates of dry goods stacked against the walls. Pemberton closed the door carefully before speaking, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "I appreciate you taking this risk, Doctor. I understand Captain Dalton doesn't respond well to questions about his management of reservation affairs. You're investigating him specifically?" Pemberton hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "I work for Senator Marcus Wellington of Massachusetts. He chairs the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and has received disturbing reports about conditions in this territory. Official channels through the Bureau of Indian Affairs have been unresponsive, which suggests either incompetence or complicity. The senator sent me to conduct a quiet assessment before deciding whether to launch a formal investigation." Jonathan felt a surge of hope at the mention of senatorial involvement. Wellington was known as a reformer, one of the few politicians in Washington who occasionally challenged the systematic exploitation of indigenous peoples. What kind of reports? Deaths from starvation on reservations that should have adequate food supplies based on federal appropriations. Medical care that exists on paper but not in practice. And financial irregularities suggesting someone is profiting substantially from the suffering. Pemberton pulled a small notebook from his coat. "Major Thornton mentioned you've documented malnutrition patterns. I need to see that documentation." Jonathan had anticipated this request. From his medical bag, he withdrew a leather portfolio containing copies of reports he'd submitted over the past 2 years. Detailed records of patients treated for malnutrition-related conditions, mortality statistics broken down by age and cause of death, and comparative analysis showing the deterioration of health outcomes since Dalton assumed command of regional Indian affairs. Pemberton reviewed the documents with practiced efficiency, occasionally making notes in his own ledger. His expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed the data. "This is damning evidence of systematic neglect. These mortality rates among children under 5 are consistent with famine conditions, yet federal appropriations for reservation food supplies have actually increased during this period." He looked up at Jonathan. "Where is the food going if it's not reaching the Apache? I've suspected diversion to civilian markets for some time, but I have no direct evidence. Supply wagons arrive at the fort regularly, but I have no access to inventory records showing what's delivered to the reservations versus what's sold elsewhere." Pemberton tapped his pencil against his notebook thoughtfully. The financial irregularities are harder to track. Dalton's cousin operates a commercial freight company based in Tucson. That company has exclusive contracts for transporting supplies to all reservations in this territory, at rates substantially higher than competitive bids. My preliminary investigation suggests the supplies being transported represent perhaps 60% of what's purchased with federal funds. The remaining 40% simply disappears into private sale, with the profits divided between Dalton and his cousin. Can you prove that? Not yet. I need access to actual delivery records from the reservations, cross-referenced against purchase orders from the Bureau. That documentation would show the discrepancy clearly enough to justify criminal charges. Jonathan considered what he'd learned from Ayasha about her father's death. There's another element you should know about. Captain Dalton may have been involved in the killing of Apache leaders who resisted his policies. There's a woman currently in custody at the fort who witnessed what she describes as a planned ambush disguised as peace negotiations 3 years ago. Pemberton's attention sharpened immediately. She witnessed this directly. According to her account, yes. Her father was one of the chiefs killed during what official reports called an Apache attack on negotiators. She claims soldiers fired first, that the entire incident was orchestrated to eliminate opposition to Dalton's control of reservation resources. I need to speak with this woman. Can you arrange that? Jonathan shook his head reluctantly. Dalton has ordered her transferred to the territorial prison in Santa Fe within the week. Once she's in federal custody, access will become nearly impossible without official court orders. Then we have very little time. Pemberton closed his notebook with decisive finality. I'll need you to help me document her testimony before she's transferred. If her account can be corroborated with physical evidence or additional witnesses, it transforms this from financial corruption into capital murder charges. That changes everything about how aggressively Washington can act. They spent the next hour planning how to conduct an interview with Ayasha without alerting Dalton's informants at the fort. It would require careful coordination and timing. Pemberton would need to gain official access through the fort commander, rather than through Dalton directly, using his credentials as a federal auditor to demand accommodation for his investigation. As Jonathan prepared to leave the trading post, Pemberton placed a hand on his arm. Doctor, you should understand what you're committing to here. If we succeed in exposing Dalton, you'll be safe enough. The evidence will be public, and attempting to silence you would only confirm guilt. But if we fail, if Dalton discovers your cooperation before we can build an airtight case, you'll become an extremely inconvenient witness to his activities. I understand the risk. Do you? Pemberton's expression was grave. I've investigated corrupt officials before. The dangerous ones aren't the incompetent bureaucrats who take small bribes. The dangerous ones are the intelligent, ambitious men who've built entire systems around their corruption and who see themselves as too important to be constrained by law. Dalton is the latter type. He won't simply discredit you or have you fired. He'll eliminate the threat you represent in whatever way proves most efficient. The warning was sobering but not surprising. Jonathan had already reached similar conclusions based on his confrontation. With Dalton that morning, I became a doctor because I believed healing people mattered more than personal comfort or security, Jonathan said quietly. If I walk away from this now, I'm admitting that principle only applies when it's convenient. I can't live with that. Pemberton nodded slowly, a hint of respect in his expression. Then we proceed. I'll arrange official access to interview the Apache woman tomorrow morning. Be ready to provide whatever medical context supports her testimony. Jonathan returned to Fort Grant by a circuitous route, taking time to ensure he wasn't being followed. Paranoia was becoming second nature as the stakes escalated. He found Major Thornton waiting near the infirmary, his expression troubled. We have a problem, the major said without preamble. Dalton has moved up the prisoner transfer. She's being transported to Santa Fe tomorrow at dawn instead of next week. The sudden change in schedule couldn't be coincidental. Why the acceleration? Official reason is that space has opened up at the territorial facility earlier than anticipated. Actual reason? Thornton shrugged. Dalton wants her away from the fort before anyone can ask. Too many questions about why she was shot in the first place. Jonathan felt the carefully constructed plan collapsing before it could even be implemented. Pemberton needs to interview her before the transfer. That's tomorrow at dawn. We have less than 12 hours. I can delay the departure by a few hours, claim there's paperwork that needs to be completed first. But Dalton will be watching the situation closely. If your auditor friend shows up demanding access to the prisoner at the last minute, it will raise immediate suspicions. They needed a different approach, something that wouldn't alert Dalton to the investigation. An idea began forming. Risky, but potentially viable. What if Pemberton doesn't request the interview directly? Jonathan suggested, what if I need to conduct a final medical evaluation before the transfer to ensure the prisoner is fit for transport? That's standard procedure for anyone with recent injuries. You could authorize it as post-surgeon without involving Dalton at all. Thornton considered this approach. It would work once, a single medical evaluation before transport. But you couldn't bring an outside civilian into that examination without proper authorization. Then Pemberton becomes my medical assistant for the evaluation. Someone I've hired temporarily to help with documentation while I conduct the physical examination. In the confusion of an early morning transfer, with proper paperwork from you authorizing the evaluation, the guards wouldn't question an additional person present for administrative purposes. The Major smiled grimly. Deceptive, irregular, and likely to get us both court-martialed if discovered. Which means it's probably our only option. He pulled out his pocket watch. It's now 6 o'clock. I can have authorization papers ready by 8. You'll need to brief Pemberton on the plan and get him into position by 5 tomorrow morning before the transfer detail assembles. Jonathan spent the evening making careful preparations. He drafted a medical evaluation form that would require extensive documentation, creating a plausible justification for why his assistant needed to be present to record Ayasha's responses. He also prepared a list of questions that would allow her to provide her testimony while ostensibly answering medical history inquiries. At midnight, he slipped out of the fort and made his way to the boarding house where Pemberton was staying. The auditor listened to the plan with increasing appreciation for its audacity. It's brilliant in its simplicity, Pemberton admitted. The best deceptions are usually the ones that operate in plain sight, using legitimate procedures to accomplish hidden purposes. They finalize the details, agreeing to meet at the holding area at 5 o'clock the following morning. Pemberton would dress in plain work clothes that could pass for a medical assistant's attire, and would carry a ledger for documentation purposes that would actually serve as his investigation notebook. Jonathan returned to the fort well after midnight, exhausted but unable to sleep. Too much depended on the morning's interview, and too many things could go wrong. If the guards questioned Pemberton's presence, if Dalton made a surprise inspection before the transfer, if Ayasha refused to speak in front of strangers, any of these scenarios could destroy their carefully constructed plan. He was reviewing his medical evaluation questions when someone knocked softly on his door. Opening it cautiously, he found Private Murphy standing in the darkened hallway looking nervous. "Dr. Hayes, sir. You need to come to the holding area. The prisoner is asking for you specifically. Says she's in severe pain from her wounds." Jonathan's first thought was that something had gone wrong with her recovery, that infection had worsened despite his treatment. He grabbed his medical bag and hurried to the holding area, where he found Ayasha sitting upright in her cell, very much not displaying signs of medical distress. The moment Private Murphy departed to resume his other duties, she spoke in a low, urgent voice. "They are moving me tomorrow. I heard the guards talking. Once I am at the prison in Santa Fe, Dalton will arrange for me to die there. An accident, they will say, or killed while trying to escape." Jonathan knelt near the cell bars, keeping his own voice quiet. "I know about the transfer. We're working on a way to document your testimony before you leave. There's a federal auditor investigating Dalton's corruption. If we can get your account on official record, it will be much harder for him to silence you. Then you should know everything, Ayesha said with sudden intensity. Not just about my father's death. About the bigger plan. What bigger plan? Dalton wants all Apache removed from this territory. Not to different reservations, removed completely. Dead or driven into Mexico, he does not care which. He has been meeting with mine owners, cattle ranchers, men who want Apache land. They have made agreements about how to divide the territory once we are gone. Jonathan felt ice forming in his chest. How do you know this? Because I was not always a prisoner. For 2 years after my father's death, I worked at the fort as a laundress, cleaning clothes and linens for officers. White people do not notice servants, do not guard their words carefully when we are in the room folding their shirts. Her eyes held fierce intelligence that belied any assumption she was merely a victim of circumstances. I heard Dalton and his associates talking many times. They speak of the Apache problem, like we are insects to be exterminated for the convenience of their businesses. Do you remember specific names? Specific details of these meetings? Ayesha proceeded to provide a catalogue of information that transformed the investigation from documentation of supply theft into evidence of conspiracy to commit genocide. She named mine owners, territorial politicians, even a federal judge who had been present at planning meetings. She described agreements about land distribution, discussions of how to provoke Apache attacks that would justify military extermination campaigns, and financial arrangements for profiting from reservation land once it was declared abandoned. Jonathan listened with growing horror, writing down every detail in his notebook. This was far larger than simple corruption or even the murder of Ayesha's father. This was a systematic plan to eliminate an entire people for economic gain, using federal resources and military authority as the instruments of ethnic cleansing. Why didn't you reveal this information before? He asked when she finished. Because I am Apache, who believes the word of one Apache woman against white soldiers and businessmen. But you are a white doctor with position and education. If you speak these truths, perhaps someone will listen. Perhaps someone will care enough to stop what is coming. The weight of that responsibility settled on Jonathan like physical pressure. Everything now depended on the morning's interview, on Pemberton's ability to transform Ayesha's testimony into actionable evidence, and on their collective ability to expose the conspiracy before Dalton could silence the witnesses. As he prepared to leave, Ayesha called to him one final time. Dr. Hayes, when you look at my scars, you see suffering. But we Apache see something else. We see survival. Every mark proves I am still here, still fighting. Remember that tomorrow when you try to save me from Dalton's plan. Some of us refuse to disappear quietly. Jonathan returned to his quarters with dawn approaching, Ayesha's words echoing in his mind. In a few hours, he would either help expose one of the most ambitious criminal conspiracies in territorial history, or he would fail, and a witness to genocide would disappear into a prison system controlled by the very people she could incriminate. There was no middle ground anymore, no safe position from which to observe without fully committing. The wounded woman he'd treated out of simple medical ethics had revealed a truth that demanded action, regardless of personal cost. As the first light of morning began illuminating the New Mexico sky, Dr. Jonathan Hayes prepared for what might be the most important medical evaluation of his career, one where the patient's survival depended not on his surgical skill, but on his courage to document truths that powerful men had killed to keep hidden. The pre-dawn darkness hung thick over Fort Grant when Jonathan met Howard Pemberton at the edge of the civilian quarter. The auditor had transformed his appearance convincingly. Rough canvas trousers, a plain work shirt, and a battered hat that suggested manual labor rather than federal investigation. He carried a leather satchel that could pass for medical supplies, but actually contained his investigation materials. Major Thornton came through, Jonathan confirmed. showing Pemberton the authorization papers. "We have clearance for a pre-transfer medical evaluation with an assistant present for documentation purposes. The guards have been instructed to allow it." They made their way through the still sleeping fort, their boots crunching on gravel, the only sound besides the occasional snort from the stables. The holding area was lit by a single lantern, and Private Murphy stood at his post looking exhausted from the night watch. "Morning. Dr. Hayes, Major Thornton said you'd be conducting an evaluation before the prisoner transfer." "That's correct, Private. This is Mr. Pemberton, my documentation assistant. The evaluation shouldn't take more than an hour." Jonathan handed over the authorization papers, which Murphy examined with the careful attention of someone trying to follow regulations he didn't fully understand. "Everything seems in order, sir. The transfer detail won't arrive until 6:30, so you have time. Should I remain present during the examination?" "That won't be necessary. Standard medical privacy protocols apply even for prisoners. We'll call if we need assistance." Murphy nodded and stepped away to his post at the far end of the corridor, leaving them with as much privacy as could be hoped for under the circumstances. Ayasha was awake and alert when they entered her cell. Jonathan had warned Pemberton about her initial wariness of strangers, but she seemed to recognize that this examination served purposes beyond medical assessment. Her dark eyes moved between the two men with calculating intelligence. "This is Mr. Pemberton," Jonathan said carefully, keeping his voice low. "He works for Senator Wellington in Washington. He's investigating Captain Dalton's activities in the territory." Pemberton stepped forward, maintaining a respectful distance. "Miss Anisha, Dr. Hayes has told me about your father's death and the circumstances surrounding it. I need to hear your account directly, in as much detail as you can provide. Everything you say will be documented and used as evidence in a federal investigation, evidence that white men will ignore, as they always do when Apache speak truth." "Perhaps," Pemberton acknowledged with surprising honesty. "But Senator Wellington is one of the few politicians in Washington who actually believes the federal government has legal and moral obligations to honor its treaties. If your testimony can be corroborated with documents or other witnesses, he will push for prosecution regardless of how powerful the accused might be." Ayasha studied Pemberton's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Ask your questions." For the next 40 minutes, Pemberton conducted an interview that was remarkable for its precision and thoroughness. He began with Ayasha's background, her childhood before the mission school, the years of abuse there, her escape and return to her father's band. Then he moved systematically through the events leading to the water rights meeting, asking for specific details about dates, locations, and who was present. Ayasha's memory proved extraordinary. She recalled not just the broad outline of events, but specific conversations, the positions of soldiers before the shooting started, even the weather conditions that day. As she spoke, Pemberton filled page after page of his notebook with precise documentation. "You said you were hidden in the trees when the shooting began," Pemberton clarified. "How far were you from the meeting site?" "Perhaps 50 yards. Close enough to hear voices, to see faces clearly. And you're certain the soldiers fired first?" "I watched a lieutenant raise his hand as a signal. 3 soldiers fired immediately at my father and the chiefs who stood with him. Only then did Apache warriors who had been waiting at a distance return fire. But by then, 6 leaders were already dead or dying. Would you recognize this lieutenant if you saw him again?" Ayasha's expression hardened. "I see his face every night when I try to sleep. Young man, maybe 25 summers. Yellow hair. Scar on his chin from an old wound. He smiled when he gave the signal to fire." Pemberton's pencil paused. Smiled? As if killing peaceful men gathering for treaty talk gave him pleasure. Jonathan watched this exchange with growing unease. The lieutenant Ayasha described sounded like Marcus Sloan, who had been promoted to captain 6 months ago and now served as Dalton's second-in-command. If Sloan had orchestrated the ambush under Dalton's orders, It meant the conspiracy involved multiple officers acting in coordination. Before Pemberton could continue his questioning, boots sounded in the corridor outside, multiple pairs moving with military precision. Jonathan's stomach dropped. The transfer detail wasn't supposed to arrive for another 20 minutes. Private Murphy's voice carried through the door. "Sir, I wasn't informed you'd be inspecting the prisoner transfer personally." Captain Dalton's reply was crisp with authority. "Plans changed, Private. I'm accompanying the detail to Santa Fe personally to ensure proper security protocols are followed." "Open the cell area." Jonathan and Pemberton exchanged quick glances. There was no time to leave, no way to avoid the confrontation. They could only hope their cover as doctor and medical assistant conducting a routine evaluation would hold under Dalton's scrutiny. The door swung open to reveal Dalton, flanked by 4 armed soldiers, all carrying rifles at ready position. The captain's eyes swept the scene, Jonathan with his medical bag, Pemberton with his notebook, Ayasha sitting against the far wall of her cell. "Dr. Hayes, I wasn't aware you'd be conducting an examination this morning." "Standard pre-transfer evaluation, Captain. Major Thornton authorized it to ensure the prisoner is medically fit for transport." Jonathan kept his voice professionally neutral. "We're nearly finished." Dalton's gaze shifted to Pemberton, assessing him with the practiced eye of someone trained to identify threats. "And you are?" "Howard Pemberton, sir. Dr. Hayes hired me to assist with medical documentation. I'm a clerk by trade, helps with the paperwork." It was a reasonable explanation, delivered with just the right mix of deference and boredom. But Jonathan saw the calculation in Dalton's eyes. The way the captain's attention lingered on Pemberton's hands, educated hands that had never done manual labor. "Despite the rough clothing, your documentation must be very thorough to require 40 minutes. Dalton stepped closer to examine Pemberton's notebook, which the auditor casually closed and tucked into his satchel. "The prisoner has a complex medical history. Sir, Dr. Hayes believes in complete records for all patients, even those in military custody." Dalton's expression revealed nothing, but tension radiated from him like heat from forge. How convenient that this thorough examination happened just hours before transfer, and without my knowledge, despite my explicit instructions that all interactions with this prisoner required my approval. "Captain, I take my orders from the post surgeon regarding medical matters," Jonathan interjected. "Major Thornton authorized this evaluation. If you have concerns about proper procedure, you should address them with him." It was a gamble, putting Thornton directly in Dalton's crosshairs. But the Major had known the risks when he signed the authorization papers, and challenging Dalton's authority over medical decisions was Jonathan's only tactical advantage. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats. Then Dalton smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "You're quite right, Doctor. Medical matters are Major Thornton's purview. I'm sure he had good reasons for authorizing an evaluation he neglected to mention during yesterday's briefing about the transfer schedule." The captain turned to his soldiers. "Secure the prisoner for immediate transport. Dr. Hayes, Mr. Pemberton, you're dismissed." They had no choice but to leave. As Jonathan gathered his medical bag, he risked a brief glance at Ayasha. Her expression remained composed, but he saw the flash of fear in her eyes, fear not for herself, but that her testimony might die with her in some convenient accident during transport to Santa Fe. Once outside, Pemberton kept walking at a measured pace until they were well clear of the holding area. Then he grabbed Jonathan's arm, his grip urgent. "We have enough. Her testimony about the ambush, combined with the financial records and your medical documentation, creates a prosecutable case. But we need to get this information to Senator Wellington immediately, before Dalton realizes what we've collected." "How long will that take?" "Ayasha said Dalton plans to kill her once she reaches the territorial prison. Telegraph to Washington takes a day if weather cooperates. Another day for the senator to review materials and issue federal warrants. Maybe 3 days total before we can have U.S. Marshals here with arrest authority that supersedes military jurisdiction." Pemberton's expression was grim. "The question is whether she survives that long." They were still discussing options when a commotion erupted near the fort's main gate. Shouting voices, the sound of weapons being readied, and then a single gunshot that echoed across the compound. Jonathan and Pemberton ran toward the disturbance, joining the crowd of soldiers gathering near the gate. Through the press of bodies, Jonathan could see what had caused the alarm. A single Apache man stood just outside the fort's entrance, hands raised in a gesture of peace, speaking in rapid Apache to the sentries who had their rifles trained on him. "He just appeared out of nowhere," one sentry was explaining to the sergeant of the guard. "Claims he's here on peaceful business, wants to speak with whoever's in charge about his sister." The Apache man was perhaps 30 years old, tall and powerfully built, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore traditional clothing mixed with items clearly taken from white settlements, a cotton shirt beneath a buckskin vest, cavalry boots worn with native leggings. But it was his face that struck Jonathan, the same high cheekbones and strong features as Ayasha, marked by a fierce intelligence that suggested careful calculation behind every word and action. Captain Dalton arrived moments later, pushing through the gathered soldiers. He assessed the situation quickly, his hand resting on his sidearm. "What's he saying?" The fort's interpreter, a half-Apache scout named Raymond, stepped forward. "He says his name is Kuruk Naiche. He's looking for his sister Ayasha, who was taken by soldiers 4 days ago. He's come to negotiate for her release." Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. Ayasha's brother had somehow learned of her capture and had walked directly into the fort to demand her return. The audacity of it was breathtaking and potentially catastrophic. Dalton's eyes narrowed with calculation. "Tell him his sister is a prisoner being transferred to federal custody for violating reservation boundaries and resisting lawful military authority. There will be no negotiation for her release," Raymond translated, and Kuruk's response came immediately, his voice carrying clearly, despite being filtered through translation. "Tell the captain that his soldiers shot at hunters who were starving because white men steal food meant for Apache. Tell him that Apache law says family can offer compensation for wrongs, that we can settle this honorably without more bloodshed." "There's nothing to settle," Dalton replied coldly. "The woman is a criminal. She'll be processed through territorial courts. If your people have concerns about reservation conditions, submit them through proper channels." Kuruk spoke again, and this time Raymond hesitated before translating. "Sir," he says he knows about the meetings at the Water Rights Agreement 3 years ago. He says his sister told him what really happened there, and that white law was violated by soldiers, not by Apache." The temperature of the confrontation dropped several degrees. Every soldier within earshot recognized the implied accusation, even if they didn't know the specific details. And Dalton's face went rigid, with barely controlled rage. "That's a lie. The attack at the water rights meeting was thoroughly investigated and found to be Apache aggression against peace negotiators." "Then let my sister speak her truth, before white judges," Kuruk replied through Raymond's translation. "Let her testify about what she saw. If Apache law was followed and soldier law was broken, Apache honor demands truth be spoken. It was a brilliant tactical move." Kuruk was publicly demanding exactly what Dalton most feared, that Ayasha be given a platform to present her eyewitness account under official circumstances where her testimony would become part of the legal record. "Your sister will have an opportunity to speak during her trial," Dalton said. But his voice carried an edge that suggested he had no intention of allowing any such trial to occur. Kuruk must have heard that edge as well, because his next words came with steel beneath them. "If my sister does not arrive safely at the white man's courts, if she dies during transport or disappears into prison, Apache will know this was murder. And blood will answer blood, as our law requires." The threat was explicit and unambiguous. Dalton had just been put on notice that Ayasha's life was being monitored, that her death would trigger retaliation. "Are you threatening military personnel?" Dalton's hand moved to his sidearm. I'm explaining Apache law to someone who seems unfamiliar with honor. Codes that govern civilized people. Kuruk's use of the word civilized was deliberate provocation, throwing back at Dalton the language whites used to justify their treatment of indigenous peoples. The standoff was escalating toward violence when Major Thornton arrived, slightly out of breath and clearly alarmed by the situation he was walking into. Captain Dalton, perhaps we should discuss this situation in my office rather than at the fort gate, where every civilian in the settlement can witness it. It was a diplomatic intervention that gave Dalton an excuse to de-escalate without losing face. After a long moment, the captain nodded curtly. Inform the Apache his sister is federal property now and will be treated according to military regulations. If he has official complaints about that treatment, he can submit them through the reservation agent's office. Thornton turned to Kuruk. Your concern for your sister is understandable. I give you my word as post commander that she'll be transported safely to Santa Fe and will receive appropriate medical care during her incarceration. That's the most I can promise under current circumstances. Kuruk studied Thornton's face with the same penetrating intensity his sister had shown, then nodded slowly. He spoke in English for the first time, his accent heavy but his meaning clear. I will remember the words of the soldier chief who promises safety. If promises are lies, I will remember that also. He turned and walked away from the fort with the same confidence he'd approached with, disappearing into the desert scrubland as quickly as he'd appeared. Soldiers muttered among themselves about the boldness of walking alone into a military installation. But Jonathan recognized it for what it was, a calculated demonstration that Apache were watching, that Ayesha's fate mattered to people who would act if she was harmed. Dalton watched Kuruk's departure with barely concealed fury. I want patrols doubled around the fort. If that savage returns, he's to be detained on sight, Captain. Thornton interjected carefully. The man came under what appeared to be a flag of peace. Detaining him for making inquiries about his sister's welfare could be seen as a violation of basic diplomatic protocols. Since when do we observe diplomatic protocols with hostiles? Since they demonstrate willingness to engage in peaceful dialogue instead of immediate violence, Thornton replied, his voice carrying an edge that suggested even his usual accommodating nature had limits. That man could have approached this situation with a dozen warriors and forced a confrontation. Instead, he came alone, spoke respectfully, and left when asked. That's the kind of Apache behavior we should be encouraging, not punishing. The public disagreement between the post commander and Indian Affairs officer was unprecedented. Soldiers watched with fascination as two senior officers engaged in barely veiled conflict. Dalton seemed to recognize he'd lost this particular battle. Fine, if the Apache returns, we'll observe proper protocols. But I want sentries alert for any signs of hostile activity in the surrounding area. That performance of peaceful intent might have been reconnaissance for a larger action. As the crowd dispersed, Jonathan found himself walking alongside Major Thornton. That was courageous, what you did just now. Standing up to Dalton publicly. Thornton's expression was weary. I've been compromising my principles for so long, I barely recognize them anymore. But watching Dalton prepare to murder a woman in custody while her brother stands outside our gates, pleading for basic justice, he shook his head. There are limits even to my cowardice. The transfer leaves in an hour. Once Ayesha is on that wagon, she's beyond our ability to protect, I know. Which is why I've arranged a small delay. Thornton pulled an envelope from his coat. These are orders requiring Ayesha to remain at Fort Grant for an additional 48 hours, pending completion of her medical evaluation. Your evaluation, specifically, which you'll now need to extend to document the full extent of her injuries and their implications for her fitness to travel. Jonathan stared at the document. Dalton will never accept this. Dalton doesn't have a choice. Those orders come directly from Territorial Medical Authority, which supersedes his jurisdiction over prisoner transport. He can appeal them, certainly, but that takes time. Time during which your federal auditor friend can get his evidence to Washington and secure those warrants. You're putting your career at risk for this. My career? Thornton laughed bitterly. My career died years ago in the bottom of a whiskey bottle. What I'm risking now is my pension, and perhaps my life if Dalton decides I've become as inconvenient as his other opponents. But that Apache man standing at our gate, asking for basic justice, while we prepare to transport his sister to a place where she'll conveniently die? He met Jonathan's eyes directly. Some things matter more than security. Took me 20 years to remember that, but I remember it now. Jonathan took the orders with hands that trembled slightly. 48 hours wasn't much time, but it might be enough for Pemberton to reach Washington with his evidence. Enough for federal intervention to arrive before Dalton could complete whatever plans he had for silencing witnesses. As he watched the sun rise fully over Fort Grant, painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and amber, Jonathan understood that they'd just crossed a threshold beyond which retreat was impossible. Dalton now knew they were actively interfering with his plans. Kuruk's appearance had made Ayasha's testimony a matter of public record that couldn't simply disappear without consequences. The next 2 days would determine whether justice could actually function in a territory where corruption had become systematic, or whether power would once again trump truth as it had so many times before. Either way, the illusion of neutrality that had protected Jonathan for 8 years was shattered completely. He was now a combatant in a war between those who believed law applied equally to everyone, and those who saw it as merely a tool for maintaining advantageous hierarchies. And combatants, he knew, rarely emerged from such conflicts unscathed. The 48-hour reprieve that Major Thornton had secured felt less like salvation and more like a ticking clock counting down to disaster. Jonathan spent the morning conducting the extended medical evaluation that officially justified Ayasha's continued presence at Fort Grant, documenting every detail of her injuries with meticulous precision. But both of them understood the real purpose of these hours: buying time for Pemberton to reach the telegraph office in Tucson and transmit his evidence to Washington. The auditor had departed before dawn, carrying copies of all their documentation concealed in a hollowed-out medical textbook. His plan was to avoid the local telegraph office, which Dalton certainly monitored, and instead make the grueling 2-day ride to Tucson, where he could send his report through channels the captain couldn't intercept. If all went according to plan, Senator Wellington would receive the evidence by tomorrow evening. But plans, Jonathan was learning, rarely survived contact with determined opposition. The first indication that Dalton was moving against them came at midday when Captain Marcus Sloan, the young officer Ayasha had identified as giving the signal to fire at the water rights meeting, appeared at the infirmary with 2 armed soldiers. "Dr. Hayes, I need to see all medical records related to the Apache prisoner Ayasha Nietzsche." "Captain Dalton's orders." Jonathan looked up from the inventory he'd been conducting. "Those records are confidential patient information. Even military prisoners are entitled to medical privacy." Sloane's expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone following orders he knew were questionable. "Captain Dalton has authorization from the Territorial Medical Board to review all documentation related to prisoners in military custody." "This isn't a request, Doctor. It's a lawful order." The authorization Sloan presented appeared legitimate enough. Official letterhead, proper signatures, legal language about oversight of medical care in territorial prisons. But the timing was suspiciously convenient, appearing less than 6 hours after Pemberton's departure. Jonathan had anticipated something like this. The real medical records, including his detailed documentation of Ayasha's testimony about the ambush, were already hidden in a location Dalton would never think to search. What Sloan would receive were sanitized versions containing only routine medical observations. "Of course, Captain. Medical records are in my office. I'll need a few minutes to locate the relevant files. He led Sloane to the small room that served as his administrative space, making a show of searching through filing cabinets before producing a folder containing generic medical documentation. Wound measurements, treatment protocols, observations about healing progress, nothing that would reveal the conspiracy they'd uncovered. Sloane reviewed the documents with obvious disappointment. This is everything. Everything related to the prisoner's medical care, yes. Was there something specific you were looking for? Captain Dalton mentioned you conducted an extended evaluation this morning. Where are those notes? Still being transcribed. Medical documentation requires precise terminology and complete descriptions. I'll have them finalized by this evening. It was a delaying tactic and Sloane knew it, but without explicit evidence that Jonathan was withholding information. The captain couldn't take more aggressive action without revealing that his real interest wasn't medical oversight, but identifying what testimony Ayesha might have provided. After Sloane departed with the sanitized records, Jonathan immediately sought out Major Thornton. He found the post surgeon in his quarters, staring at a half-empty whiskey bottle with the expression of a man wrestling with temptation. "They're coming after the medical records," Jonathan reported. Sloane took the decoy files, but it won't take long for Dalton to realize they don't contain what he's looking for. Thornton pushed the whiskey bottle away with visible effort. He's also filed an official complaint about my interference with the prisoner transfer. Claims I exceeded my authority by issuing medical detention orders without consulting the officer in charge of the prisoner's custody. Can he overturn your orders? With enough pressure on the right territorial officials, probably. I'm expecting a telegram from Santa Fe by this evening, either confirming my authority or stripping it away. The Major's hands shook slightly as he lit a cigarette. What worries me more is that Dalton's moving faster than anticipated. He's not just protecting his interests anymore, he's actively hunting for evidence of our investigation. The situation deteriorated further that afternoon when Private Murphy appeared at Jonathan's door looking frightened and agitated. "Dr. Hayes, sir, I need to speak with you privately." "It's urgent." They stepped into an examination room where Jonathan closed the door carefully. Murphy's usual composed military bearing had cracked, revealing genuine fear beneath. "Captain Dalton questioned me for 2 hours about the medical evaluation you conducted with that assistant. He wanted to know what was discussed, whether the prisoner said anything beyond answering medical questions, what exactly your assistant was writing in his notebook." "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that I remained at my post at the far end of the corridor as you instructed, that I couldn't hear the specific conversations." "But, sir, he didn't believe me. Or rather, he believed me, but saw it as incompetence on my part." Murphy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He's transferring me to Fort Huachuca, effective immediately. Says it's routine reassignment, but everyone knows Fort Huachuca is where they send soldiers being punished. 6 months at that isolated post ends careers." Jonathan felt a surge of guilt. Murphy was being punished for following proper medical protocols and respecting patient privacy. "I'm sorry, Private. You did nothing wrong. That's not why I came to warn you, sir. Before Captain Dalton dismissed me, he mentioned something else. He said he'd sent a patrol to intercept a civilian contractor who left the fort this morning, carrying what might be stolen military property. Said the contractor was headed toward Tucson on horseback, traveling alone." The words hit Jonathan like cold water. "Did he mention the contractor's name?" "No, sir." "But how many civilians left Fort Grant before dawn, heading to Tucson?" "Howard Pemberton." Dalton had somehow learned of his departure and sent soldiers to intercept him. If they caught the auditor with the investigation documents, everything they'd worked for would be destroyed, and Pemberton himself would likely face charges of espionage or theft of military records. As soon as Murphy departed, Jonathan made a decision that terrified him but seemed unavoidable. He had to warn Pemberton somehow, which meant leaving the fort immediately and riding hard to intercept him before Dalton's patrol could. He found Major Thornton and explained the situation. The older man's expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed the implications. If you leave now, Dalton will know you're involved in whatever Pemberton is doing. There'll be no maintaining the fiction that you're just a physician concerned about patient welfare. That fiction died this morning when Sloan came for the medical records. Dalton already suspects. He's just gathering evidence before making his move. If Pemberton is caught with those documents, we lose our only chance to expose what's happening here. Thornton was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Take my horse. He's faster than anything in the regular stable. There's a narrow canyon trail about 15 miles northwest that connects to the main Tucson road. If you push hard, you might reach it before Dalton's patrol intercepts Pemberton on the main route. What about you? Dalton will know you helped me. The Major's smile was sad but genuine. I've been hiding behind regulations and whiskey for 2 decades, Jonathan. Maybe it's time I remembered what it feels like to stand for something, regardless of consequences. Jonathan gathered minimal supplies, water, dried food, his medical bag in case of emergencies. He was saddling Thornton's horse when Ayesha's voice called to him from the holding area. Dr. Hayes, you leave to help the white man who documents the truth. How did you... Jonathan stopped, recognizing the futility of asking how Ayesha knew things. She demonstrated a remarkable ability to gather information despite being confined. Yes, he's in danger because he tried to help you. Then take this. She reached through the cell bars, offering a small object, a carved stone pendant on a leather cord. My brother left it this morning, hidden where soldiers would not see. He said, if white allies need safe passage through Apache lands, show this to any of our people you encounter. It marks you as one under Naich family protection. Jonathan accepted the pendant, understanding the significance of what she was offering. Your brother is watching the fort? My brother is watching everything. He knows soldiers were sent to hunt your friend. If you ride fast enough, you may find help on the trail that you do not expect. The cryptic comment made more sense an hour later when Jonathan, pushing Thornton's horse to its limits across the desert terrain, spotted smoke signals rising from a distant mesa. The patterns meant nothing to him, but he recognized them as communication. Apache scouts reporting positions and movements across the territory. The canyon trail Thornton had mentioned cut through a narrow defile between red sandstone cliffs, the kind of terrain that made perfect ambush country. Jonathan approached cautiously, very aware that if Dalton's patrol had already passed through, he might be riding directly into hostile guns. Instead, he found Kuruk Naiche standing beside his horse at the canyon entrance. As if he'd been expecting Jonathan's arrival, Dr. Hayes, you ride with purpose. My sister's protector seeks someone? Jonathan reined in his horse, breathing hard from the desperate pace. A federal auditor carrying evidence about your sister's testimony? Captain Dalton sent soldiers to intercept him before he can reach Tucson. If they catch him, all the evidence of what happened to your father will be destroyed. Kuruk's expression remained impassive, but his eyes reflected quick calculation. This white man who carries the truth, he rides alone on the main road to Tucson. Yes, he left before dawn. The patrol sent after him probably departed 2 hours ago. Then soldiers are ahead of him now, waiting in the rocks, where the road narrows through Skeleton Pass. 3 soldiers with rifles. They prepare an ambush. Will claim your friend attacked them, was killed in self-defense. Kuruk stated these facts with the certainty of someone who had observed the preparations personally. Can we reach him before they do? Kuruk studied Jonathan for a moment. Why do you risk this? You are white, doctor. You have safety, position. My sister is an Apache prisoner. The man carrying papers is a stranger to you. Why do you sacrifice your safety for people who are not your tribe? It was a fair question, one Jonathan had asked himself repeatedly over the past days. Because what's happening to your people is wrong. Because Captain Dalton is a murderer hiding behind military authority. Because if I don't act when I have the chance to prevent further injustice, then I'm complicit in that injustice. Kuruk nodded slowly, as if Jonathan had passed some unspoken test. Apache have word for this. Iti means strength of character that acts even when action brings danger. White men rarely show iti when Apache are involved. He swung onto his horse in a single fluid motion. Come, we take a trail through the heights. Reach Skeleton Pass before your friend arrives. But we must ride like the wind itself moves us. What followed was the most harrowing ride of Jonathan's life. Kuruk led them along paths that seemed impossible for horses, narrow ledges along cliff faces, steep ascents through loose scree, passages so tight Jonathan had to dismount and lead his horse through sideways. But the Apache moved with absolute confidence, reading the terrain with ancestral knowledge that transformed deadly obstacles into navigable routes. They reached the heights overlooking Skeleton Pass as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Below them, Jonathan could see exactly what Kuruk had described. 3 soldiers positioned behind rocks on either side of the narrow passage, their rifles aimed at the approach trail. Anyone riding through would be caught in a devastating crossfire. "Your friend comes," Kuruk said quietly, pointing to a distant dust cloud on the trail below. A single rider, moving at the steady pace of someone trying to cover ground without exhausting his horse. Howard Pemberton, unaware he was riding directly into an ambush. "We have to warn him," Jonathan said urgently. "If we fire a shot, signal somehow, gunshot alert soldiers. They kill him immediately, claim he was warned by Apache accomplices." Kuruk's eyes narrowed as he calculated angles and distances. "Different way. You stay here. I circle down through the canyon. When I give a signal, raven call like this," he demonstrated a harsh cawing sound. "You ride down the main trail, shouting a warning. Soldiers turn attention to you. In that moment, I reach your friend. Bring him to safety through the side ravine. The soldiers will shoot me if I ride straight at them. Yes, this is why you must trust that I reach you before their bullets do." Kuruk met Jonathan's eyes directly. "My sister says you have it. Now I see if she speaks the truth." Before Jonathan could respond, the Apache warrior had vanished into the landscape, moving with such speed and silence that within seconds Jonathan couldn't track his position anymore. He was alone on the heights, watching Pemberton draw closer to the ambush with every passing moment. The next few minutes stretched into eternity. Jonathan dismounted and crept forward to a position where he could see both the soldiers' ambush site and the trail Pemberton was following. The auditor was perhaps 5 minutes from the killing zone. Below, the soldiers remained in position, fingers on triggers. Waiting, then came the raven call, harsh and urgent. Cutting through the desert air, Jonathan kicked his horse into immediate gallop, plunging down the steep trail toward the pass while shouting at the top of his lungs, "Pemberton, it's a trap! Soldiers in the rocks!" The soldiers below spun toward this new threat, rifles swinging to aim at Jonathan's charging horse. He saw muzzle flashes, heard bullets singing past his head, felt his horse stumble as one round grazed its flank. The animal recovered its footing and continued its desperate plunge toward the floor of the pass. But in those crucial seconds when the soldiers' attention was focused on Jonathan, Kuruk had materialized beside Pemberton's horse like a ghost condensing from desert air. The auditor's startled shout was cut off as Kuruk grabbed the bridle and yanked both horses into a narrow side ravine that Jonathan hadn't even noticed from above. The soldiers realized their primary target was escaping and began firing at the ravine. But Kuruk and Pemberton were already beyond the angle of fire, disappeared into terrain that only someone with intimate knowledge of the landscape could navigate. Jonathan was less fortunate. His horse's injury had slowed their pace, and he was still exposed in the middle of the pass when the soldiers redirected their attention toward him. He felt a bullet slam into his left shoulder with force that nearly knocked him from the saddle. Pain exploded through his arm and chest as he clung desperately to the reins, urging his wounded horse toward the minimal cover of rocks at the far end of the pass. He made it to the rocks as another volley of shots kicked up dust around him. His shoulder was bleeding heavily, his left arm essentially useless. Behind him, he could hear the soldiers advancing, their voices carrying clearly in the desert air. "That's the fort doctor. Dalton said he might try to warn the auditor. Is he hit? Shoulder wound, looked like. He's not getting far." Jonathan fumbled for the revolver at his belt, knowing it was essentially hopeless. 3 trained soldiers against 1 wounded man, with minimal combat experience. The only comfort was that Pemberton had escaped with the evidence. Whatever happened now, the documentation would reach Washington. He heard footsteps approaching his position, preparing himself for the inevitable confrontation. Then came a sound that transformed the tactical situation completely, the distinctive metallic clicking of multiple rifle bolts being worked simultaneously. White soldiers. "Drop your weapons. You are surrounded." The voice spoke accented English from multiple positions in the rocks above the pass. Jonathan couldn't see the Apache warriors, but the soldiers certainly could, based on their sudden stillness. From his position, he watched the 3 men exchange glances, calculating whether to risk a firefight against an unknown number of opponents holding the high ground. Kuruk appeared beside Jonathan so suddenly it startled him despite the circumstances. "Your shoulder? How bad?" "Bullet went through. Painful but probably not fatal." "Good. You have it, and also luck." "Rare combination." Kuruk examined the wound with practiced efficiency, then called out in Apache to the warriors in the rocks. One descended carrying what looked like moss and herbs. "This stops bleeding, prevents infection." Apache medicine, older than white man's doctoring. As he applied the natural compress to Jonathan's wound, Kuruk kept his attention on the soldiers below. "White warriors, ride back to your fort. Tell Captain Dalton that Apache watch these lands. Tell him that men who travel under Knight's family protection are not to be harmed. Tell him blood has been answered with mercy this time, but mercy has limits." The soldiers didn't need further encouragement. They mounted their horses and retreated back toward Fort Grant at a pace just short of panicked flight. As their dust trail faded in the distance, Pemberton emerged from the ravine where he'd been concealed, his expression mixing relief, shock, and profound gratitude. "Dr. Hayes, you saved my life. And Mr. Nietzsche," he turned to Kuruk, "I don't know how to thank you properly. No thanks needed. You carry the truth about murder of my father. This makes you a family ally. Apache protect family." Kuruk secured the bandage on Jonathan's shoulder with final efficiency. "But now both of you must leave this territory quickly. Dalton knows you interfere with his plans. He will not stop at 3 soldiers in ambush. Next time, he brings more men, more guns, strikes when you do not expect." "I need to reach Tucson," Pemberton said. "Send this evidence to Washington by telegraph." "And I need to return to Fort Grant," Jonathan added, though even saying it he recognized the impossibility. Dalton would have him arrested or killed the moment he set foot on military property. Kuruk shook his head firmly. "Fort Grant death trap for you now, Doctor. And Tucson is too dangerous. Dalton has friends there who watch the telegraph office. But there is a third way." He pointed northwest toward distant mountains. "Apache scouts loyal to my family watch Fort Bowie. That post has a telegraph, has commander who is not a friend to Captain Dalton. From there, your paper carrier can send his truth words. And you, Doctor, will be protected until your government sends men with law power to arrest Dalton." It made strategic sense. Fort Bowie was 5 days' ride northwest, far enough from Dalton's influence to provide some security. And if what Kuruk said about the commander there was accurate, they might find support rather than additional hostility. "What about your sister?" Jonathan asked. "Ayasha is still in custody at Fort Grant. Dalton will use her as leverage once he realizes we've escaped." Kuruk's expression hardened. "My sister knows her place in this fight. She's bait that holds Dalton's attention while other pieces move on the game board. But time grows short. Your paper carrier must send his words to Washington before Dalton can silence all voices that speak truth." As the sun set over Skeleton Pass, painting the desert in shades of crimson and gold, 3 men from vastly different worlds began a desperate journey to Fort Bowie. A frontier doctor with a wounded shoulder and shattered assumptions about his own courage. a federal auditor carrying evidence that could topple a criminal conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of territorial government, and an Apache warrior protecting his sister by allying with the very people whose kind had killed his father. The night ahead would be long and dangerous, but they rode with purpose now, carrying not just evidence, but also the weight of those depending on them to succeed. Failure meant Ayesha's death, the continued suffering of the Apache, and the triumph of corruption over justice. Behind them, Fort Grant receded into darkness, a fortress that had become a prison not just for indigenous captives, but for truth itself. Ahead lay Fort Bowie and whatever uncertain sanctuary it might provide. The tightening net Dalton had thrown around them had broken, at least for now. But nets could be repaired and thrown again, and their enemy was far from defeated. The real battle was only beginning. The journey to Fort Bowie became a test of endurance that pushed all three men to their limits. Kuruk set a punishing pace through terrain that seemed designed to break both horses and riders. Steep mountain passes where loose rock threatened to send them tumbling into ravines. Waterless stretches where the sun beat down like a physical assault. And narrow canyons where a single wrong turn could trap them for hours. Jonathan's shoulder wound throbbed with every jarring movement. The Apache herbal compress keeping infection at bay, but doing little for the pain. He'd refused Kuruk's offer of peyote for pain management, needing to stay alert despite his body's protests. Pemberton rode with the grim determination of a man who understood that his survival was secondary to the mission he carried. The documents concealed in his satchel represented the only chance to stop Dalton before more people died. They traveled primarily at night, when cooler temperatures and darkness provided natural concealment. During daylight hours, they rested in whatever shelter Kuruk identified: caves, overhangs, once in the ruins of an abandoned Apache village that had been burned by soldiers years earlier. The charred remains of what had once been homes served as a stark reminder of what awaited the territory if Dalton's plan succeeded. On the second night, as they navigated a treacherous descent into a canyon system that would supposedly cut a full day off their journey, Pemberton finally asked the question that had been weighing on him since their escape from Skeleton Pass. "Mr. Nature, you could have let those soldiers kill me. The evidence I carry might help your sister, but it also documents the systematic failures of federal Indian policy. Once this reaches Washington, it will create political upheaval that could take years to resolve. Your people might not see justice in your lifetime." Kuruk guided his horse around a boulder before responding, his voice carrying clearly in the desert night. "White men always think in seasons. This year, next year, maybe 5 years from now. Apache think in generations. My grandfather's grandfather lived in these mountains. My grandson's grandson will also, if we survive what white men do to us now." He paused to help Jonathan navigate a particularly difficult section of trail. "The paper words you carry? They are seeds. Maybe they will grow into justice next year. Maybe they will grow in 10 years. But if seed is never planted, nothing grows ever." It was a perspective born from centuries of displacement and survival, a longer view of history than Jonathan's culture typically considered. The realization humbled him, while he'd been congratulating himself on his moral courage. Ayesha and Kuruk had been playing a strategic game spanning generations, understanding that their actions today might not bear fruit in their own lifetimes. The third day brought their first real crisis. They'd emerged from the canyon system at dawn to find themselves facing an unexpected obstacle: a cavalry patrol of at least 15 soldiers moving parallel to their position. Close enough that Jonathan could hear officers shouting orders. Kuruk immediately led them into a cluster of boulders that provided minimal concealment. They dismounted and waited in tense silence as the patrol drew closer. Through gaps in the rocks, Jonathan could see the unit was larger than standard patrol size and carried supplies, suggesting they were on an extended mission. "They're searching for something specific," Pemberton whispered. "That's not a routine patrol, it's a manhunt. For us." Jonathan asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Kuruk nodded grimly. Dalton sends many soldiers. He knows we flee toward Fort Bowie, blocks the direct routes. The Apache warrior studied the patrol's movement with tactical assessment. These soldiers spread wide, checking all approaches. We cannot go forward without being seen. Can we circle around them? Circle takes 3 extra days. By then, more soldiers arrive. Create net that cannot be avoided. Kuruk's jaw tightened with the decision. Only one path forward now. We wait until dark, then ride through their picket line. Fast and quiet. If discovered, we do not stop. We run until horses can run no more. It was a desperate strategy, but they had no alternatives. They spent the day hidden in the boulders, rationing their diminishing water supply and watching the soldiers establish a camp barely a mile from their position. Jonathan used the time to rebandage his shoulder wound, noting with clinical detachment that despite Kuruk's herbal treatment, signs of infection were beginning to appear. He needed proper medical attention soon, or the wound would become seriously dangerous. As darkness fell, Kuruk outlined their plan with the precision of someone who had evaded military patrols his entire adult life. They would leave their horses temporarily and approach the picket line on foot, identifying the sentries' positions and timing their rotations. Once they'd located a gap in the coverage, there was always a gap if you watch patiently enough, they would retrieve their horses and ride through at maximum speed. If shooting starts, do not try to fight, Kuruk instructed. 15 soldiers with rifles, 3 of us with pistols and 1 rifle. We cannot win a battle. Can only win escape. So we ride toward Fort Bowie and hope our horses are faster than cavalry mounts. The execution of this plan required nerves Jonathan hadn't known he possessed. They crept to within 50 yards of the nearest sentry, close enough to hear the young soldier muttering to himself about the tedious nature of night watch. Kuruk spent nearly an hour observing the patrol patterns, timing the intervals when sentries turned their attention in different directions. Finally, he signaled. They moved back to their horses, mounted silently, and approached the picket line at a walk that wouldn't immediately alert the sentries. For several heart-stopping minutes, they moved through the gap Kuruk had identified, every hoofbeat sounding impossibly loud in the night silence. They were almost through when Pemberton's horse stumbled on loose rock, the clatter breaking the stillness like a gunshot. "Who's there?" A sentry's challenge rang out, followed immediately by the sound of a rifle being cocked. "Ride!" Kuruk shouted, abandoning stealth for speed. They kicked their horses into full gallop as shouting erupted behind them. Gunfire lit up the night, muzzle flashes and the crack of rifles discharging. Jonathan heard bullets whining past his head, felt one tug at his coat sleeve. Beside him, Pemberton was hunched low over his horse's neck, riding with the desperation of a man who understood that slowing meant death. The cavalry camp exploded into chaos behind them, more shouting. The sound of horses being saddled, officers bellowing orders. But Kuruk was already leading them into terrain that would make pursuit difficult, weaving between boulders and up a steep incline that forced their horses to scramble but would slow the heavier cavalry mounts even more. They rode at killing pace for over an hour before Kuruk finally allowed them to slow to a walk. Behind them, they could hear the pursuit, fainter now but still persistent. Dalton's soldiers wouldn't give up easily. "Fort Bowie is a half-day ride," Kuruk panted, his own horse lathered with exertion. "But cavalry knows this now. They will send fast riders ahead. Tell Fort Bowie commander we are fugitives. Dalton's lies reach the fort before truth does. Then we need to reach someone at the fort who'll listen to us before Dalton's version becomes the official story," Pemberton said. He pulled out his credentials from the satchel. "I have authorization from Senator Wellington. That should carry weight with any honorable commanding officer." "Should carry weight," Jonathan repeated. "But will it? For all we know, Fort Bowie's commander is another of Dalton's allies. We could be riding straight into custody." Kuruk shook his head. "Fort Bowie commander is Colonel Samuel Harrison. He has a reputation among Apache, hard man but honest. Does not make war on women and children. does not break treaty words when convenient. If the paper carrier can reach Harrison before Dalton's soldiers poison his thinking, Harrison will listen. They rode through what remained of the night, exhaustion warring with urgency. Jonathan's shoulder wound had reopened during the desperate flight, blood seeping through the bandages. His vision occasionally blurred from pain and blood loss, but he forced himself to remain conscious. They'd come too far to fail now. Dawn found them on a ridge overlooking Fort Bowie. The military installation sat in a valley below, significantly larger than Fort Grant, with proper defensive walls and what appeared to be several hundred soldiers garrisoned there. Even from a distance, Jonathan could see increased activity, riders coming and going, sentries posted at twice the normal density. "They've been warned," Pemberton observed grimly. "Look at the gate. They're checking everyone who enters." Kuruk studied the fort with the practiced eye of someone who'd observed military installations for strategic purposes his entire life. "Back entrance, where supply wagons deliver. Less guarded, because soldiers think walls protect that side. If we approach from the arroyo to the west, come up behind the quartermaster building, we may enter unnoticed." "And then what?" Jonathan asked. "We can't just walk up to the commander's office covered in trail dust and blood, demanding an audience." "No," Pemberton agreed. "But I can send a message through proper channels, requesting immediate meeting with Colonel Harrison on urgent federal business. My credentials as Senator Wellington's investigator should get his attention, even if Dalton has been spreading lies about us." The plan they devised was risky, but potentially viable. Kuruk would guide them to the rear entrance he'd described, where they would separate. The Apache warrior would remain hidden outside the fort. His presence would only complicate an already difficult situation. Jonathan and Pemberton would enter, find the administrative offices, and request formal audience with Colonel Harrison. Through official protocols that would be harder for subordinate officers to dismiss, executing. This plan required waiting until midday, when supply wagons were most active. They used the intervening hours to clean themselves as best they could, transforming from fugitives into something approaching presentable civilians. Jonathan borrowed a shirt from Pemberton to replace his blood-stained one, and they used precious water to wash their faces and hands. As noon approached, they made their move. Kuruk led them down through the arroyo system, navigating terrain that kept them below sightlines from the fort's walls. They emerged behind a supply building exactly as he'd predicted, with multiple wagons being unloaded, providing convenient distraction. Before separating, Kuruk gripped Jonathan's good shoulder. "If Harrison will not listen, if Dalton's poison has reached too deep, do not let them take you alive. Better to die fighting than die slowly in Dalton's custody." "I'll remember that advice." "Thank you, Kuruk, for everything." The Apache warrior's stern expression softened slightly. "My sister saw the truth in you before I did. She has a gift for reading white men's hearts. Tell Harrison about her. Tell him a daughter of chiefs sits in chains, while her father's murderers walk free. Sometimes even hard men respond to honor debts." Then he was gone, vanishing into the landscape as if he'd never existed. Jonathan and Pemberton walked boldly toward the supply entrance, adopting the confident posture of people who belonged there. Several soldiers glanced their way but didn't challenge them. Civilians were common enough around supply areas that two dusty men didn't immediately trigger suspicion. They made it inside the fort perimeter and located the administrative building without incident. But approaching the entrance, they encountered their first real obstacle. A sergeant major manning the reception desk who looked up at them with the suspicious efficiency of someone trained to spot irregularities. "Help you, gentlemen?" Pemberton produced his credentials with practiced smoothness. "Howard Pemberton, investigator for Senator Marcus Wellington of Massachusetts. I need to speak with Colonel Harrison immediately on urgent federal business." The sergeant major examined the credentials carefully, his expression shifting from suspicion to calculated assessment. "Senator Wellington, that's the one who chairs the Committee on Indian Affairs." "Correct." The matter I need to discuss with Colonel Harrison involves irregularities in the administration of Apache reservations in this territory. It cannot wait. I see. The sergeant major's tone suggested he saw quite a bit more than Pemberton might have wished. You wouldn't happen to be the federal auditor that Captain Dalton sent a telegram about yesterday? The one supposedly traveling with stolen military documents? The trap had been set even better than they'd feared. Dalton had not only warned Fort Bowie about their approach, but had specifically identified Pemberton and accused him of espionage. Before Pemberton could respond, Jonathan stepped forward. "Sergeant Major, my name is Dr. Jonathan Hayes. I've served as a civilian physician at Fort Grant for 8 years. The documents Mr. Pemberton carries aren't stolen. They're medical records and investigative materials documenting serious crimes by Captain Richard Dalton, including murder, corruption, and conspiracy to commit genocide against Apache populations. We're requesting Colonel Harrison review this evidence before taking any action based on Captain Dalton's accusations." The directness of the approach seemed to catch the sergeant major off guard. He studied both men carefully, clearly weighing conflicting orders against his own judgment about their credibility. "Wait here," he finally said, disappearing into an inner office. Jonathan and Pemberton exchanged glances. They were committed now. Either Harrison would see them, or they'd be arrested on Dalton's authority. There was no middle ground remaining. The sergeant major returned 5 minutes later, with a colonel in tow. Samuel Harrison was perhaps 55, with iron-grey hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades on frontier postings. His eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who hadn't reached his rank through political connections. "Alone, Mr. Pemberton. Dr. Hayes, I received an interesting telegram from Captain Dalton yesterday claiming you're fugitives carrying stolen military property. Yet you walk into my fort in broad daylight requesting an official meeting." Harrison's expression was unreadable. "That suggests either extraordinary stupidity or confidence that you have facts that will change my perspective." "Which is it?" Pemberton met the colonel's gaze directly. "Facts, sir. Documented evidence that Captain Dalton has been systematically stealing federal appropriations meant for Apache reservations, orchestrating the murder of indigenous leaders who resisted his authority, and planning a campaign of ethnic cleansing disguised as military necessity. I have financial records, medical documentation, and eyewitness testimony to these crimes. That's an extraordinary accusation against a decorated officer." "Yes, sir. Which is why I'm requesting you review the evidence before deciding whether to believe Captain Dalton's characterization of us as fugitives and thieves." Harrison was silent for a long moment, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Then he nodded curtly. "My office, now. Sergeant Major, no one is to know these men are here. If anyone asks, tell them I'm conducting a classified review of sensitive materials." No interruptions. They followed Harrison to a spacious office dominated by maps of the territory and commendations from various campaigns. The colonel closed the door firmly before speaking again. "You have 1 hour to convince me you're not the criminals," Dalton claims. "If you fail, I'll have you both in irons and on your way back to Fort Grant by sunset. If you succeed," his expression hardened, "then we'll discuss what actions can be taken against a captain who appears to have been operating his own criminal enterprise under the color of military authority." Pemberton opened his satchel and began laying out documents on Harrison's desk. Financial records showing the discrepancy between appropriations and deliveries. Jonathan's medical documentation of starvation conditions on reservations. Ayasha's testimony about the ambush at the water rights meeting. The evidence accumulated in neat stacks that told a story of systematic corruption and violence. Harrison reviewed each document methodically, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed both his intelligence and his familiarity with reservation administration. As he read Ayasha's testimony about her father's death, his jaw tightened visibly. "Chief Naiche. I knew him. We negotiated water rights together before that meeting. He was an honorable man trying to find peaceful solutions for his people." Harrison looked up at Jonathan. "And you're claiming Captain Dalton orchestrated his murder?" "His daughter witnessed it firsthand, sir. She was there, hidden in the trees. She saw Lieutenant Sloan give the signal for soldiers to fire first. The official report claiming Apache aggression was a fabrication designed to justify what was actually a planned assassination. Where is this daughter now?" "In custody at Fort Grant, awaiting transfer to the territorial prison. Dalton has ordered her moved because her testimony threatens to expose his crimes." Harrison stood and walked to his window, staring out at the parade ground where soldiers conducted their afternoon drills. For several minutes he said nothing, the silence stretching until Jonathan began to fear they'd failed to convince him. Then the colonel turned back, his expression resolved. "Gentlemen, what you've shown me is the most disturbing evidence of military malfeasance I've encountered in 30 years of service. If even half of this is accurate, Captain Dalton needs to be arrested immediately and court-martialed for crimes that would disgrace any officer." He paused, his voice dropping. "The problem is jurisdiction. Dalton operates under authority of the Territorial Indian Affairs Administration. I command Fort Bowie, but I have no direct authority over his operations at Fort Grant, unless ordered by higher command." "Senator Wellington can provide that authority," Pemberton said urgently. "If you send a telegram to Washington detailing what we've shown you, the senator can issue federal warrants that supersede territorial jurisdiction." Harrison nodded slowly. "That could work, but we need to move faster than telegrams. Dalton will have learned by now that you escaped his ambush at Skeleton Pass. He'll be taking steps to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses, particularly this Apache woman whose testimony is so damaging." The colonel moved to his desk and began writing rapidly. "I'm issuing orders for a detail of 30 soldiers to ride immediately to Fort Grant with federal marshal authority. Their mission: secure the Apache prisoner Ayesha Naiche in protective custody and place Captain Richard Dalton under arrest pending investigation. I'll also send telegrams to the territorial governor and Senator Wellington informing them of actions taken." "Dalton has significant military forces at Fort Grant," Jonathan warned. "He won't surrender peacefully, which is why I'm sending 30 soldiers instead of 3, and why I'm leading the detail personally." Harrison's expression was grim but determined. "If Dalton resists lawful orders from a superior officer, that transforms this from investigation into active mutiny. Even his political allies won't be able to protect him from that." As Harrison continued issuing orders and preparing documents, Jonathan felt the crushing weight of tension that had gripped him for days finally begin to ease. They'd reached Fort Bowie. They'd convinced Harrison. The machinery of military justice was now in motion, but they weren't safe yet. Fort Grant was a full day's hard ride from Fort Bowie. Anything could happen in that time. Dalton might execute Ayesha and claim she died trying to escape. He might barricade himself with loyal soldiers and trigger a siege situation. Or he might simply disappear into the territory with enough stolen money to start over somewhere else, leaving his crimes unpunished. The next 24 hours would determine whether justice could actually function in a system corrupted by men who believed themselves above the law. Jonathan had committed everything, his career, his safety, possibly his life, to the belief that it could. Now, as Colonel Harrison's soldiers prepared for the confrontation at Fort Grant, he would discover whether that belief had been naive idealism or justified faith in the possibility that right could triumph over might. Either way, the final gambit had been played. All that remained was waiting to see if the evidence they'd gathered and the allies they'd found would prove sufficient to bring down a man who'd built an empire on the suffering of the powerless. The sun was setting over Fort Bowie when Harrison's detail rode out, 30 soldiers moving with the grim purpose of men tasked with arresting one of their own. Jonathan and Pemberton watched from the fort walls as the column disappeared into the desert twilight. carrying with them the last hope for Ayesha's survival and the exposure of crimes that had festered in darkness for far too long. All they could do now was wait. The waiting was its own form of torture. Jonathan spent the night at Fort Bowie's infirmary, where the post-surgeon, a competent man named Dr. Marcus Webb, properly cleaned and sutured his shoulder wound. The infection had been caught early enough that aggressive treatment with carbolic acid and fresh bandages would likely prevent serious complications, though Webb warned him the injury would require weeks of careful management. "You're lucky," Webb remarked as he worked. "Another day or two without proper treatment, and you'd be looking at amputation to prevent septic poisoning from spreading." Lucky wasn't how Jonathan would have described his situation, but he understood the surgeon's perspective. He was alive, relatively intact, and in a position to see justice potentially served, compared to where he'd been 48 hours earlier, wounded and fleeing through the desert with cavalry. Hunting him, his current circumstances represented significant improvement. Pemberton spent the night drafting detailed reports to Senator Wellington, documenting every aspect of their investigation and the evidence they'd compiled. The auditor worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that written records often mattered more than verbal testimony when it came to holding powerful men accountable. Politicians respond to documentation, Pemberton explained, as he filled page after page with precise observations. Dalton may have allies in Washington, but once these reports are part of the official Senate record, those allies will distance themselves to avoid being implicated in his crimes. Political survival trumps loyalty every time. Neither man slept much. They took turns watching the eastern horizon, waiting for some sign of Colonel Harrison's return. The detail had left with orders to reach Fort Grant by midnight, secure the prisoner, and arrest Dalton before dawn, when most soldiers would be sleeping and resistance could be minimized. If all went according to plan, they should return to Fort Bowie by late afternoon the following day. But plans, as Jonathan had learned painfully over the past week, rarely survived contact with determined opposition. Dawn arrived with agonizing slowness. Jonathan checked his pocket watch compulsively, calculating and recalculating the timing. Harrison should have reached Fort Grant hours ago. If everything had gone smoothly, Ayesha would already be in protective custody, and Dalton would be in chains. But if Dalton had prepared defenses, if loyal soldiers had resisted arrest orders, if violence had erupted, the possibilities spiraled through increasingly dark scenarios that Jonathan forced himself to stop imagining. Speculation served no purpose except to amplify anxiety. Mid-morning brought the first news. A courier riding hard from the direction of Fort Grant, his horse lathered from the brutal pace. Jonathan and Pemberton were in Colonel Harrison's office when the young private delivered his message. "Sir, Colonel Harrison sends word. The situation at Fort Grant has been complicated." The careful phrasing sent Jonathan's stomach dropping. Complicated how? The courier addressed his superior officer rather than the civilians. Captain Dalton was prepared for the arrest attempt. He'd barricaded himself in the armory with approximately 20 soldiers loyal to him, holding the Apache prisoner as hostage. Colonel Harrison has established a perimeter and is attempting to negotiate surrender. But Captain Dalton is demanding safe passage to Mexico in exchange for the prisoner's release. Pemberton's expression darkened. He's trying to bargain his way out using Ayesha as leverage. Will Harrison agree to those terms? Colonel Harrison's orders were explicit, sir. No negotiations. Captain Dalton will be taken into custody regardless of his demands. But the colonel is trying to resolve the situation without bloodshed if possible, particularly because the prisoner's life is at risk if shooting starts. A hostage standoff. It was perhaps the worst possible outcome, short of Ayesha being already dead. Dalton had maneuvered himself into a position where any aggressive action to arrest him would likely result in his killing her. But allowing him to escape meant justice would never be served. How long has this standoff been ongoing? Jonathan asked. Since approximately 3 o'clock this morning, sir. That's 6 hours with no resolution. Major Thornton, who had also been present for the courier's arrival, spoke for the first time. Dalton doesn't have enough supplies to hold out indefinitely. Water alone becomes critical after 12 hours, with 20 men in a confined space. He's gambling that Harrison will choose the prisoner's life over arrest protocols. He's miscalculated then, the courier said with certainty. Colonel Harrison was very clear in his messages. Captain Dalton has 1 hour to surrender unconditionally. After that, the colonel will authorize assault on the armory with full understanding that casualties may result. 1 hour. In 60 minutes, the situation would either resolve peacefully or descend into violence that would likely cost Ayasha her life, along with those of soldiers on both sides. Jonathan felt helpless rage at being so far from events, unable to influence the outcome. Then an idea struck him, desperate but potentially viable. "I need to go to Fort Grant. Now." Everyone in the room turned to stare at him. "Dr. Hayes, that's impossible." The officer who'd taken command in Harrison's absence said firmly, "You're a witness in a federal investigation, and you're still recovering from a gunshot wound. We can't risk—" "Ayasha trusts me," Jonathan interrupted. "I'm the only person at Fort Grant who treated her with basic human dignity. If I can speak with her during this standoff, if I can communicate that help has arrived and she just needs to survive a few more hours, it might change her calculations about what's possible. Or it might give Dalton another hostage to bargain with," Pemberton countered. "Perhaps, but I'm a civilian, not military. Dalton can't claim he's fighting against unjust military authority if he's also threatening to kill a civilian doctor. It undermines his narrative and might cause some of his supporters to reconsider their loyalty." Major Thornton nodded slowly. "The doctor has a point. Dalton's been portraying himself as a victim of overreach by career military officers who don't understand frontier realities. Having a respected civilian physician present as witness changes that story significantly." The debate continued for another 15 minutes before the acting commander reluctantly agreed to allow Jonathan to return to Fort Grant with the next courier dispatch. Pemberton would remain at Fort Bowie, continuing his documentation and preparing to testify if the situation resulted in courts-martial proceedings. As Jonathan prepared to leave, Pemberton gripped his hand firmly. "You've risked everything already, Jonathan. You don't need to risk more." "Yes, I do. I'm the one who promised Ayasha that justice was worth pursuing, that the system could actually work if people were willing to stand for what was right. If she dies because I was too cautious to see this through to the end, then everything we've done means nothing." The ride back to Fort Grant was punishing. Jonathan pushed his horse to the edge of its endurance, knowing that every minute mattered. His shoulder wound ached brutally, but he barely noticed through the fog of determined urgency. He arrived at Fort Grant in late afternoon to find the installation transformed into a siege operation. Colonel Harrison had positioned soldiers around the armory with clear fields of fire, but orders not to shoot unless Dalton's men initiated violence. A tense quiet hung over the scene, the kind of silence that preceded either resolution or catastrophe. Harrison himself was positioned behind cover near the armory entrance, in occasional shouted communication with Dalton inside. The colonel's expression shifted from grim determination to surprise when he saw Jonathan approaching. "Dr. Hayes, I didn't authorize your presence here." "I know, sir, but I'm asking permission to attempt communication with the prisoner. She knows me, trusts me. I might be able to give her information that changes her assessment of the situation, or Dalton might simply shoot you the moment you approach." "That's possible," Jonathan acknowledged. "But if he shoots an unarmed civilian doctor trying to provide medical care to a wounded prisoner, he loses any remaining claim to legitimate grievance. Some of his men might surrender rather than be complicit in that level of brutality." Harrison considered this carefully, then nodded. 5 minutes. Approach with your hands visible. Identify yourself clearly as medical personnel. If Dalton refuses to allow communication, retreat immediately." "Understood?" "Understood." Jonathan walked slowly toward the armory entrance, hands raised at shoulder height, his medical bag hanging from one hand. "Captain Dalton, this is Dr. Jonathan Hayes. I'm requesting permission to provide medical evaluation for the prisoner. She has injuries that require ongoing treatment." Silence greeted this announcement. Then Dalton's voice, strained and hostile, emerged from within the armory. "The good doctor returns. Tell me, Hayes, did you enjoy playing spy for the federal government? Gathering evidence against a decorated officer doing his duty in impossible circumstances?" "I documented medical conditions on reservations under your administration, Captain. The evidence speaks for itself about whether you were doing your duty or profiting from systematic theft and murder." Noble words from someone who's destroyed his own career for the sake of savage sympathies. Dalton's voice carried an edge of desperation beneath the bravado. "You had position, respect, a future. Now you're a traitor who conspired with Apache hostiles against his own people." "I conspired with the truth against corruption. There's a difference." Jonathan took another step closer to the armory. "Let me see Ayasha. Let me verify her condition. That's basic medical protocol even for prisoners." Another long silence. Then the armory door opened slightly, and Ayasha was shoved into the opening, Dalton's arm around her throat, using her as a human shield. Even from 20 feet away, Jonathan could see she'd been beaten. Her lip was split, one eye swelling shut, fresh bruises on her arms. "Your patient, Doctor," Dalton said with vicious mockery. "As you can see, she's alive. Whether she stays that way depends entirely on whether Colonel Harrison is willing to be reasonable about safe passage arrangements." Jonathan met Ayasha's eyes, trying to communicate reassurance despite the horror of seeing her battered condition. "I need to examine her injuries to determine if immediate medical intervention is required. She's fine. The same injuries don't kill Apache that would incapacitate civilized people. The casual racism would have been enraging under other circumstances." Now Jonathan simply filed it away as additional evidence of Dalton's fundamental unfitness for authority over indigenous populations. "Let me speak with her privately if she confirms she doesn't need immediate medical care. I'll withdraw and this standoff can continue." Dalton laughed harshly. "So she can tell you our defensive positions? Give you intelligence about ammunition and supplies?" "I'm not an idiot, Hayes. No, just a murderer and a thief who's run out of options." The words emerged before Jonathan could calculate their wisdom. But he was past the point of diplomatic caution. "You killed Ayasha's father at a peace meeting. You've been stealing federal appropriations meant to feed starving families. You've orchestrated violence to justify land seizures. Those aren't accusations anymore, Dalton. They're documented facts in federal hands. Senator Wellington's office has everything. The territorial governor has been notified. Even your political allies can't protect you now." The truth of these statements must have registered because Dalton's expression shifted from mocking confidence to something uglier, the cornered desperation of someone realizing that bluffing wouldn't save him. "Then I have nothing to lose," he said quietly. And Jonathan saw his grip tighten on Ayasha's throat. "Accept your life," Colonel Harrison's voice carried clearly across the space between them. "You're still a U.S. Army officer, Dalton. Surrender now, face courts-martial for your crimes, and you'll at least get a trial with opportunity to present your defense. Kill that woman and resist arrest, and my soldiers have orders to respond with lethal force." "You won't leave that armory alive, but she'll be dead too," Dalton countered. "Is that acceptable collateral damage, Colonel? How does that look in your official report, that you allowed a prisoner in federal custody to be murdered rather than negotiate?" "It looks like the tragic but unavoidable consequence of a corrupt officer choosing violence over accountability," Harrison replied with icy precision. "No one will blame me for your decisions, Captain." The standoff had reached its critical inflection point. Dalton had to choose between surrendering to face justice or killing Ayasha and dying in the subsequent assault. For a terrible moment, Jonathan thought Dalton might choose the latter out of simple spite, destroying his final victim before being destroyed himself. Then Ayasha spoke. her voice rough from the chokehold, but carrying clearly. "Captain Dalton, you speak of honor and duty. Here is Apache duty. If you kill me now, my brother will hunt you even into death itself. He will find everyone you love, everyone who carries your name, and he will show them exactly what you have shown my people. Your family will pay the blood price for my death across generations." It was a brutal promise, delivered with absolute conviction, and Dalton seemed to recognize it as more than an empty threat. Kuruk had already demonstrated his ability to operate invisibly throughout the territory. If Ayasha died, her brother would become an implacable force of vengeance that no amount of military protection could guard against. The calculus had shifted. Dalton's hand loosened slightly on Ayasha's throat as he processed this new variable in his survival equation. "Put down your weapons and release the prisoner," Colonel Harrison called out. "Last warning, Captain. You have 60 seconds to comply before I order an assault." For those 60 seconds, time seemed to stop. Jonathan could hear his own heartbeat, the nervous shifting of soldiers in position around the armory, the distant call of a raven that reminded him painfully of Kuruk's signal at Skeleton Pass. Then, with the defeated fury of someone recognizing that all paths led to destruction, Dalton shoved Ayasha away from him. She stumbled, but managed to stay upright, immediately moving toward Jonathan's position. "Stand down!" Dalton's voice echoed from inside the armory. "All personnel, weapons on the ground, hands visible. We're surrendering to federal authority." The relief that washed over Jonathan was so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. Soldiers moved swiftly to secure the armory, taking Dalton and his loyalists into custody with efficient professionalism. Within minutes, the captain was in chains, being led away under armed guard, his face a mask of impotent rage. Jonathan reached Ayasha as she emerged fully from the armory. Up close, the extent of her injuries was even more apparent. Dalton had beaten her systematically during the standoff, perhaps trying to break her spirit or simply venting his frustration on the most available target. "Let me examine your injuries," Jonathan said gently, guiding her to a nearby bench. "I will survive," Ayasha replied, though she winced as she sat down. "I have survived worse than the captain's anger," as Jonathan cleaned her wounds and applied fresh bandages. Colonel Harrison approached with an expression of profound respect. "Miss Knight, I want to apologize on behalf of the United States Army for what you've endured. Captain Dalton's actions were criminal and do not represent the values or conduct expected of officers under my command." Ayasha studied the colonel with the same penetrating assessment Jonathan had come to recognize. The pretty words, "But will there be justice?" Or just more words and empty promises like those given to my father before soldiers killed him. Harrison's jaw tightened. "There will be justice. Captain Dalton will face courts-martial for murder, corruption, theft of federal property, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The evidence gathered by Dr. Hayes and Investigator Pemberton will be presented. You'll be asked to testify about what you witnessed at the water rights meeting. Your father's death will be officially acknowledged as unjustified killing rather than legitimate military action." "And what of my people starving on reservations while white men steal food meant for us?" "That's a larger problem that extends beyond Captain Dalton's personal corruption," Harrison admitted. "But Senator Wellington's office has been provided documentation of the systemic issues. There will be congressional investigations, policy changes, enforcement of existing treaty obligations. I can't promise overnight transformation, but I can promise that what you've survived and witnessed won't be ignored or dismissed." Ayasha was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached up and removed a small pendant from around her neck, similar to the one she'd given Jonathan, but with different markings. "Give this to the senator when you send your reports. Tell him it's from the daughter of Chief Naiche, given as a token of hope that white men's law might someday serve justice instead of just serving itself. If that hope proves false, he can return this token to my people as sign that we were right not to trust." Harrison accepted the pendant with appropriate gravity, understanding the weight of what had been offered. "I'll ensure Senator Wellington receives this personally, along with your message." As the afternoon faded into evening, Fort Grant gradually returned to something approaching normalcy. Dalton and his loyalists were confined under guard, awaiting transport to Santa Fe for courts-martial proceedings. Major Thornton, who had finally found his courage, resumed command of the fort with orders from Harrison to begin immediate reforms of reservation supply distribution. Jonathan found himself standing at the edge of the parade ground as the sun set, watching Ayasha speak with her brother. Kuruk had appeared seemingly from nowhere once the standoff ended, materializing at the fort gate to be reunited with his sister. They stood together now, speaking in low voices, occasionally looking in Jonathan's direction. Finally, they approached him together. Kuruk spoke first. "Dr. Hayes, my sister lives because you chose honor over safety. That is debt, Apache, do not forget. I only did what any decent person would do." "No," Ayasha corrected gently. "Most people choose safety. You chose differently. That makes you rare among white men, and worthy of respect." She stepped forward and, before Jonathan could react, placed both hands on either side of his face, a gesture of profound significance in Apache culture. "He would later learn. You healed my bullet wounds," she said quietly. "But you did something more difficult. You healed my belief that white men are incapable of seeing Apache as fully human. That is deeper healing than any medicine can provide." Jonathan felt an unexpected emotion tightening his throat. "What will you do now? Where will you go?" "Back to my people. Tell them what has happened. Begin the long work of rebuilding trust that men like Dalton destroyed." She smiled slightly, the expression transforming her battered face. "And perhaps remind them that one white doctor risked everything to stand with us. Sometimes stories of alliance matter as much as stories of betrayal." Kuruk extended his hand in the white custom of greeting. When Jonathan grasped it, the Apache warrior's grip was firm and meaningful. "You are welcome in our lands. Doctor, always. That is the promise of the Nietzsche family, and our word carries weight among all Apache bands." They departed as the last light faded from the sky, vanishing into the landscape that had birthed and sustained their people for countless generations. Jonathan watched until they disappeared completely, feeling simultaneously exhausted and more purposeful than he'd felt in years. Pemberton arrived from Fort Bowie the following morning, having received word that the crisis had resolved without bloodshed. He and Jonathan spent 2 days providing detailed testimony to military investigators, documenting every aspect of Dalton's crimes and the evidence they'd gathered. On the 3rd day, as Jonathan prepared to leave Fort Grant for the final time, Colonel Harrison called him to his temporary office. "Dr. Hayes, I've received communication from Senator Wellington. He's requesting your presence in Washington to testify before the Committee on Indian Affairs about conditions you've observed in the territory. Your medical documentation will be central to his proposed reforms of reservation policy." Washington. Jonathan had barely considered what came next, had been too focused on surviving each immediate crisis to think about the future. "The senator is specifically interested in your perspective as a physician who worked within the system but maintained ethical standards despite pressure to compromise them. He believes your testimony will be more credible than investigators who arrived after the fact." Harrison paused. "There's also a position being offered. Territorial Medical Administrator with authority to oversee healthcare on all reservations in New Mexico and Arizona. Significant salary increase, real authority to implement changes, direct reporting to the Bureau of Indian Affairs rather than through military channels." It was everything Jonathan had never dared to hope for. Meaningful work, institutional authority to address systemic problems, recognition that his principles hadn't been naive idealism but necessary courage. "I accept," he said without hesitation. "When do I leave for Washington?" "Week from today. That gives you time to prepare your testimony and recover from your injuries." Harrison extended his hand. What you did here, Dr. Hayes, standing against corruption when it would have been easier and safer to look away, that takes a particular kind of courage. The territory needs more men like you. As Jonathan left the office, he encountered Major Thornton supervising the distribution of the first honest food shipment to the nearby Apache reservation. The older surgeon looked 20 years younger, his face reflecting purpose that had been absent during all the years Jonathan had known him. "I've stopped drinking," Thornton announced without preamble. 3 days sober. Vigor if I found my spine after 2 decades of cowardice, I can find the discipline to stay away from whiskey. "I'm glad," Jonathan said sincerely. "The fort needs a competent surgeon, and you're that when you're sober." "I am. And I plan to stay that way." Thornton's expression grew serious. "Jonathan, I need you to understand something. What happened here, Dalton's arrest, the exposure of his crimes, none of it would have occurred if you hadn't been willing to treat that wounded Apache woman despite knowing the personal cost. One act of simple human decency cascaded into systemic change. Remember that when you're in Washington dealing with politicians and bureaucrats, individual choices matter, even when the system seemed too large to change." The words resonated with profound truth. Jonathan had treated Ayesha's wounds because it was the right thing to do, with no expectation that it would lead to anything beyond providing comfort to someone suffering. Yet that single decision had unraveled a criminal conspiracy, exposed corruption reaching to the highest levels of territorial administration, and potentially changed the trajectory of federal Indian policy. Individual choices did matter, sometimes more than could ever be anticipated in the moment those choices were made. A week later, as Jonathan boarded the stage that would carry him to the railhead and eventually to Washington, he carried with him not just documentation and testimony, but something more valuable: renewed faith that acting on principle, even when costly and dangerous, could actually make a difference in a world that often seemed structured to reward only cynicism and self-interest. The wounded Apache woman who had bitten him in that cell had taught him something more valuable than any medical text could contain: that healing wasn't just about treating physical injuries, but about having the courage to address systemic sickness, even when doing so threatened your own safety. As the stage rolled eastward across the desert landscape, Jonathan understood that his real education in frontier medicine was only now beginning. The scars he carried, both physical and psychological, were marks not of trauma but of transformation. He had entered that cell as a careful, cautious physician trying to maintain neutrality in impossible circumstances. He emerged as someone who understood that true healing required fighting the forces that created suffering in the first place. And that understanding, hard won through fear and danger and choices that could never be unmade, would guide everything he did in the years ahead. The most beautiful thing he'd seen on the frontier, he reflected, wasn't the dramatic landscapes or the triumph of justice over corruption. It was the moment when Ayesha, battered and scarred, and every reason to hate all white men, chose to believe that alliance was possible, that despite everything, hope remained worth nurturing. That was the scar he would carry forward, not the bullet wound in his shoulder, but the mark left by witnessing courage, more profound than any he'd imagined himself capable of. And perhaps that was the real story worth telling. Not about a doctor who saved an Apache woman, but about how an Apache woman saved a doctor from the moral numbness that frontier life too often demanded. Some healings, he understood now, worked both ways. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.